In the small town of Braunau am Inn, on the quiet border between Austria and Germany, a child was born on April 20, 1889. The world was peaceful in this provincial corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But in the home where Adolf Hitler drew his first breath, a silent storm was brewing, one that would shape his mind and decades later the fate of millions. His father, Adolf Hitler, was a man of cold discipline and rigid order. Adolf was a senior customs official, a position he had worked hard to achieve. He had come from a simple peasant background and was proud of his uniform and his authority. In his home, he was not just a father, he was the ultimate rule maker. Adolf demanded absolute obedience from everyone. A shadow of fear hung over the household whenever he was present. The architecture of Braunau, with its old stone buildings and traditional European style, framed Adolf's early sense of isolation. This was not a place of joy and freedom for the boy. It was a backdrop to his small, controlled life. He was the fourth of 6 children, but several of his siblings had died in infancy before he was born. This fact cast a special light on him, particularly in the eyes of his mother. Clara Hitler was the complete opposite of her husband. She was pious, gentle, and overflowing with affection. Her deep, almost suffocating love was centered on Adolf, the fragile boy who had survived where others had not. Clara sheltered her son from everything she could. She was his protector, the one who dried his tears after he faced his father's harsh anger. Adolf adored her with an intensity that would stay with him throughout his life. These two conflicting forces created a strange and dangerous mixture in the young boy's mind. From his father, he learned to fear and respect only one thing: power and authority. He saw that the only way to escape punishment was to follow orders without question. From his mother, he received a constant feeling that he was special, that he was the most important person in her world. Clara's affection shielded him from the harsh reality of the world and fed his growing sense of self-importance. As Adolf grew, the dynamic between his father and mother molded his character. He became a sullen and stubborn boy. He would not give in easily to demands from others unless they were backed by the same absolute authority his father used. When he faced punishment or disappointment, he retreated into a quiet, simmering resentment. He did not let his anger show on the outside. Instead, he fed it on the inside, allowing it to grow. This resentment was also directed at his peers. In his initial school years, the early signs of an arrogant and unyielding attitude began to appear. Adolf was not a popular boy. He was not natural at making friends. He saw other children either as followers or as rivals. He needed to be the center of attention, the leader, just as he was in his mother's eyes. If he could not be the best, he became defensive and resentful. He would rather be alone than be just another face in the crowd. School also introduced him to new authority figures, his teachers. Like his father, they demanded order and obedience. For the first time, Adolf was not the center of his mother's protected world. He was just another student. He had to earn praise with hard work, not with his mere existence. His early successes in drawing and singing gave him a taste of being special, but the routine and requirements of other subjects left him cold. His arrogance began to clash with the school system. He was lazy in any subject that did not capture his personal interest. He did not see the value in learning things that would not directly help him to stand out. His stubbornness was mistaken for intelligence by some of his early teachers, while others saw it for what it was, a proud refusal to try. He already believed he was above the common people and the common rules. The provincial world of Braunau am Inn was a stage for the small dramas of his childhood. He walked the cobblestone streets, past the traditional Austrian houses, and heard the constant talk of border rules and official business. He absorbed the feeling of being in a small, closed-off place where order was paramount. The River Inn was a constant reminder of the boundary between two powerful nations, but also a barrier to a larger world he could only dream of. In the family's modest rooms, the quiet war of his parents continued. Clara would often sit by the window, the dramatic shadows of the old building playing across her face, watching her son. She would tell him stories of his grandparents and of her simple, hard-working people. She instilled in him a sense of destiny, a belief that he was destined for great things. Adolf, with his intense, dark eyes, listened with a strange gravity, absorbing every word. But this sense of destiny was constantly being attacked by the reality of his father's expectations. Awa saw no greatness in his son's artistic dreams. He wanted Adolf to follow in his footsteps, to become a reliable, hard-working official for the state. He wanted Adolf to understand the value of order, not of the chaotic world of imagination. The conflicts between father and son became a daily ritual of shouting and resentment. Clara's piety added another layer to his world. The church, with its stone arches and old rituals, was a place of comforting routine. Adolf singed in the church choir for a short time, and the grandeur of the music and the powerful architecture made a deep impression on him. For a brief period, he not wanted to become a priest, attracted by the idea of an authority figure who was also a kind of king, with power that was both spiritual and total. But the real power in his world was his father. Adolf's early rebellion was not a fight for freedom, but a struggle to replace one authority with another. He did not want to escape from order. He wanted to be the one who created it. From his mother, he got the belief that he was the right person for this role. From his father, he got the blueprint for how to use power. The combination was a ticking time bomb in his developing mind. His first experience with loss also came during these early years. Several of his younger siblings died when he was a small boy, further intensifying Clara's desperate love for him. He saw the pain of his mother and the stoic, silent grief of his father. He learned that even the most powerful authority could not control everything, that the boundaries between life and death were absolute. This gave him a sense of urgency, a feeling that his destiny was something he needed to achieve before it was too late. The setting of his childhood played a crucial role in shaping his identity. He was an Austrian, a subject of the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire. He was aware of the many peoples who lived within the empire, but he also felt a special connection to the German nation across the border. He heard the languages of many cultures on the streets of Braunau, but the feeling of being on a boundary gave him a sense of being part of something bigger, a German nation that existed beyond the rules of his father and the borders of his small world. In his late childhood, a significant change arrived in the form of a move to a small farm. His father, now retired, had finally realized his dream of being a simple farmer. For the first time, Adolf had a little more freedom from his father's constant watch. He could explore the fields and woods, dream his dreams without being constantly brought back to the routine of school. But his father was still there, a constant presence of rules and requirements, now with the added burden of manual labor. The farm gave Adolf a new appreciation for the simple, traditional life of the peasant. He saw the cycles of nature, the hard work of the soil, the beauty of the landscape. He internalized this connection to the land and the people, transforming it later into a part of his nationalistic ideology. But on a personal level, he still felt separate from it, still believed he was destined for something more than a life of farm work. His mother was his constant in this new, changing world. She continued to be his source of unconditional love, his protector from both the physical and emotional harshness of his father and the world. Adolf, now a young boy, began to develop a strange and intense protective instinct towards her. He would often watch her, as if he could prevent any further pain or loss from touching her life. This feeling of being her special protector added another layer to his growing sense of self-importance. In his own mind, he was not just a son. He was a kind of guardian for his mother, a central figure in a drama of love and survival. He needed to be strong, to be important, not just for his own sake, but for hers. In the final years of his childhood, the conflicts with his father reached a peak. Awa was growing older and more impatient. He could not understand his son's artistic dreams, his refusal to accept a simple, stable future. He became more demanding and more critical. Adolf, in turn, became more sullen and more resentful, his inner fire growing into a quiet, simmering anger. The first chapter of Adolf Hitler's life was not just a series of random events. It was a carefully woven tapestry of conflicting forces, a world where love and fear, authority and rebellion, provincial order and personal ambition were in a constant state of tension. From his mother, he got the belief that he was special. From his father, he got the blueprint for power. This was the genesis of his dark future, the first few lines in a story that would become a tragedy for the entire world. The shadows of Braunau am Inn were not just memories. They were a blueprint for the future. The dusty provincial roads of Linz were quickly forgotten as the train rattled towards the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For 18-year-old Adolf Hitler, emerging from the cramped, shadow-filled rooms of his childhood, Vienna was not just a city. It was the shining stage where his genius would finally be acknowledged. He arrived in 1907, a young man fueled by an absolute, unshakable conviction in his own artistic destiny. His pockets were light, containing only the meager inheritance left after his tyrannical father's death and the hard-won savings of his adoring, now mortally ill mother, Clara. But his heart was heavy with ambition. He carried a portfolio stuffed with sketches of grand buildings and idealized figures, seeing them as keys that would unlock the doors of the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts. Vienna, with its monumental Ringstrasse, opulent opera houses, and bustling coffee shops, seemed to promise a future of glory that would erase the humiliations of his youth. He felt superior to the mass of travelers around him, believing he belonged to the elite world of creators and visionaries. He found a small, dark room, sharing the narrow space and the smell of stale tobacco with his only friend from Linz, August Kubizek, an aspiring musician. While Kubizek spent his days immersed in the rigorous study of harmony and counterpoint, Hitler's routine was chaotic, defined by grand fantasies and a profound distaste for structured work. He spent hours wandering the magnificent streets, his eyes fixed not on the people, but on the facades of the imperial architecture. He filled notebooks with crude blueprints for a total reconstruction of Berlin and Linz, creating imaginary cities where every arch and column was perfectly placed. He was already the architect of his own imaginary empire. The mundane reality of preparing for the entrance exam, the life-drawing classes, the study of perspective, the disciplined practice, seemed beneath him. He was a genius, he reasoned, and genius did not need to study. He believed his innate talent would shine through the rough edges of his technique, captivating the stern, sophisticated professors of the academy. He approached the examinations with an arrogance that masked a deep, unacknowledged fear of failure, a fear that was about to become his crushing reality. The day of the examination arrived, and Hitler joined a crowd of anxious young artists in the echoing halls of the academy. He submitted his portfolio, filled with buildings that looked stiff and figures that seemed oddly lifeless, and then waited. The subsequent rejection was not just a disappointment, it was a devastating assault on his very identity. The notification was curt, informing him that his test drawing was unsatisfactory, and that he lacked the architectural fitness necessary for admission. It was a rejection he simply could not comprehend. How could they not see his vision? How could they dismiss the grandeur of his concepts? The refusal shattered the brittle shell of his confidence, exposing the raw resentment beneath. He convinced himself that the decision was not based on merit, but on prejudice, a conspiracy of the elite to keep a true talent down. This belief, this narrative of victimhood, would become a central pillar of his worldview. The world, he decided, was stacked against him, and the professors of Vienna were the gatekeepers of this corrupt system. He didn't just fail, he was failed by a malicious, unworthy establishment. This crushing blow was quickly followed by an even deeper tragedy. News arrived from Linz that his mother, Clara, was losing her battle with breast cancer. Hitler returned home, and for several agonizing weeks, he devoted himself entirely to her care. He, who had always recoiled from the vulgarity of illness and physical weakness, became a tender, tireless attendant. He sat by her bedside for hours, holding her hand, bathing her forehead, and attempting to soothe her pain. He was devastated by the impending loss of the one person who had offered him unconditional love, the one person who had always validated his belief in his own exceptionalism. When she finally passed away in December 1907, a part of Hitler died with her. Her death left him truly alone, removing the last stabilizing influence in his life. He returned to Vienna after the funeral, but the city now seemed different, colder, more menacing. The light of his ambition had been dimmed, replaced by a brooding, dangerous sadness. He carried not only the stigma of artistic failure, but also the profound emptiness of grief, a void that would soon be filled with darker passions. Hitler applied to the academy once more, perhaps driven by a desperate need to honor his mother's memory or by a final, fading spark of hope. But the result was the same. Another rejection, another polite refusal to recognize his perceived genius. This second failure solidified his conviction that the artistic world was closed to him, locked tight by a corrupt and unworthy elite. His money began to run out. The inheritance was gone, and the support of his family had dried up. He could no longer afford the comfortable poverty he had shared with Kubizek. He moved into progressively cheaper and grimmer lodgings, eventually abandoning all contact with his former friend. By 1909, Hitler had descended into the darkest corners of Vienna, forced to live in squalid, homeless shelters, often sleeping on iron beds in overcrowded, disease-ridden night asylums. He was now one of the submerged population he had once looked down upon with such disdain. He was poor, filthy, hungry, and utterly forgotten. This period of extreme hardship was a profound humiliation for a young man who had arrived in the city believing he was destined for greatness. In these bleak shelters, surrounded by the desperate and the broken, Hitler's simmering resentment began to find a new, terrible focus. Vienna was a city boiling with political and racial tensions. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was fragmented, its many nationalities, Czechs, Hungarians, Serbs, Poles, jostling for power and recognition. German Austrians, once the undisputed ruling class, felt their dominance threatened. In the face of this anxiety, anti-Semitism was a powerful and readily available force. The city's populist mayor, Karl Lueger, openly used anti-Semitic rhetoric to mobilize the working and lower middle classes. The popular press, which Hitler devoured, was filled with vicious cartoons and articles that blamed Jews for every ill, from economic collapse to the erosion of traditional values. Hitler, who had previously shown little active hatred towards Jews, began to see them as the source of all his personal failures. They, he convinced himself, were the secret power behind the academy that had rejected him, the corrupt force that manipulated the economy, and the alien race that was actively undermining the greatness of the German people. His transformation was fueled by the visceral conditions of his life. In the crowded homeless shelters, he saw human beings reduced to the level of beasts. He observed the struggle for a piece of bread, a warm blanket, a moment's respite from the cold. Instead of fostering empathy, this experience solidified his Darwinian view of the world, a world defined not by cooperation or compassion, but by a ruthless struggle for existence. He saw weakness as a sin and strength as a virtue. He began to apply this brutal logic to entire peoples, convincing himself that the German race, to which he proudly belonged, was engaged in a life-or-death battle against alien forces, principal among them the Jews. He became a familiar, disturbing figure in the shelters, often launching into impassioned, anti-Semitic monologues that mirrored the headlines he had read. He would speak with a sudden, startling intensity, his pale face flushing as he blamed the Jews for Germany's defeat in imaginary battles and for the poverty that gripped his own life. Most of his listeners ignored him, but some, equally broken and angry, began to listen. He was finding his voice, not in art but in hatred. Even in this abyss of poverty, Hitler refused to see himself as a common laborer. He despised manual work, viewing it as degrading and beneath his station as a German artist. Instead, he scraped together a minimal income by painting postcards of Vienna's famous landmarks, the Stephansdom, the Karlskirche, the Opera House. He would sell these crude, commercial images to tourists and art dealers for a few pennies, just enough to buy a piece of bread and a moment of warmth. He often worked in the dim light of a reading room or a crowded cafe, the same structures that had once been the focus of his grand architectural fantasies now reduced to the size of a postcard. This petty commerce was a final, ironic twist to his artistic dreams. He was not creating great art. He was mass-producing souvenirs. The contrast between the monumental beauty of the architecture he painted and the sordid reality of his own existence only deepened his rage. Every postcard sold was a reminder of his failure, a testament to the world's refusal to recognize his true potential. By 1913, Hitler's time in Vienna was coming to an end. He was now a deeply radicalized man, his personality defined by a complex web of personal humiliation, racial paranoia, and an insatiable hunger for power. The city that had rejected his artistic dreams had instead given him a purpose, a dark ideology that would guide his future actions. He now saw his life not as a quest for personal glory and art, but as a struggle for the destiny of the German people. He was determined to leave Austria, which he now despised for its multiculturalism and its perceived weakness. His eyes were turned towards Germany, towards Munich, a city he believed was the true spiritual home of the German people. When the opportunity to escape Austrian military service arose, he seized it, slipping across the border in May 1913. He left behind the imperial capital that had shattered his dreams, but he carried with him the seeds of a catastrophe that would soon engulf the entire world. The rejection in Vienna was not the end of his ambitions. It was the brutal, transformative forge that created the dictator. For a long time, Adolf Hitler felt like a stranger in his own life. He had no real job, no home, and no family to speak of. His dreams of becoming a great artist in Vienna had fallen apart, and Munich, where he had moved in 1913, hadn't been much better. He was drifting, a young man with a lot of anger and very little purpose. The logic of his life seemed to be leading nowhere. But everything changed in the summer of 1914. Europe was a powder keg, and when a Serbian nationalist shot the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the entire continent began to explode. For Hitler, the news of the war wasn't a tragedy, it was a salvation. He always remembered that moment. He was standing with a large crowd in the Odeonsplatz, Munich's central square, when the announcement came. There is a famous photo from that day, showing a man who looks exactly like a young Hitler, his eyes shining with excitement, a faint smile on his lips. Whether that man is really him or not, the emotion in the photo is very true. Hitler later wrote that when he heard the news, he fell to his knees and thanked God for letting him live in such an exciting time. He felt that at last, he had a chance to show what he was made of, a chance to be part of something much bigger than himself. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a loser. His first step was to join the army. Even though he was an Austrian citizen, he wanted to fight for Germany. The bureaucratic chaos of the early war days worked in his favor. He petitioned the Bavarian government and was surprisingly granted permission to join a Bavarian regiment. He was assigned to the 1st Company of the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, commonly known as the List Regiment, after its first commander. He was finally a soldier, wearing the uniform of the land he had adored from afar. The early weeks of the war were a blur of quick training. He and his fellow recruits were given the basics of how to march, handle a rifle, and follow orders. Hitler was a good soldier. He didn't complain, he followed instructions perfectly, and he always kept his uniform and equipment in good condition. But he also stood out. He didn't share the typical dreams of other young soldiers, visions of winning glory and returning home as heroes. For Hitler, the army was his home. He had nowhere else to go. The List Regiment was quickly sent to the Western Front, where the neat lines on the maps were dissolving into a messy, bloody stalemate. They arrived in Belgium just as the First Battle of Ypres was starting in October 1914. This was their baptism of fire. The battlefield was a horror show. The constant rain had turned the land into a sea of deep, sticky mud. The air was thick with the smell of explosives and death. The noise of artillery shelling was loud and never-ending. Hitler later described the experience as a terrible, grand moment. In their very first major engagement, the regiment suffered terribly. Many of his comrades, boys he had trained with just weeks ago, were wiped out. In just a few days of heavy fighting, the regiment's strength was cut by almost half. For Hitler, who was always a loner, this shared danger began to create something new for him, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just Adolf Hitler, the failed artist. He was one of the men of the 16th Bavarian Regiment, fighting for the German nation. Because he could read and write well and had a strong voice, Hitler was soon given a different job. He became a regimental message runner. He wasn't fighting in the front lines as much, but his new job was incredibly dangerous. When a shell or machine gun fire cut the telephone lines, which was often, someone had to carry handwritten orders between the regiment's headquarters and the frontline companies. That person was Hitler. His job required him to be out in the open when everyone else was in their trenches. He had to run across no man's land, often in the dark or under a hail of enemy fire. He later claimed that many times shells exploded right next to him, and he escaped without a scratch. To the other soldiers who saw runners dying almost every day, Hitler's luck seemed extraordinary. He started to believe it was a sign from a higher power. He began to think that he was being preserved for some important destiny. The war on the Western Front had settled into trench warfare. This was a slow, grim, and very dirty kind of war. The two sides built deep, complex systems of trenches that stretched across hundreds of miles. Life in the trenches was a constant struggle. The men lived in small, dark, and damp dugouts. They were always cold, dirty, and hungry. Diseases spread quickly. Rats were everywhere, feeding on the dead bodies in no man's land. For Hitler, who had a strong sense of personal neatness and a deep fear of dirt, this environment was a constant test. He seemed to handle it by pulling back even further into himself. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink, and he didn't share the normal soldier jokes about women. He would sit in a corner, often silent, and simply observe. To his fellow soldiers, he was a brave but very strange and distant man. Despite being a quiet loner, Hitler gained the respect of his commanders and comrades for his courage. In December 1914, just a few months after joining, he was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, for his actions during the First Battle of Ypres. This was a major honor for a common soldier, and something he was incredibly proud of. Later, in 1918, he would receive the Iron Cross, first class, an even rarer honor based on the recommendation of a Jewish officer, a fact that would become a strange footnote to his later actions. The years dragged on. 1915, 1916, 1917, Hitler's regiment moved up and down the front, participating in some of the war's most famous and bloodiest battles. In 1916, they were at the Somme, a battlefield that became a synonym for senseless slaughter. Here, Hitler was wounded for the first time. A shell fragment hit him in the thigh. He spent months in a hospital back in Germany, and he hated it. When he was given permission to go to Berlin on leave, he found a city that seemed tired and defeated, full of people who were losing their will to fight. It made him furious. He was eager to get back to the only place where he felt at home, his regiment at the front. By 1918, both sides were exhausted. Germany made one final, massive push, a desperate attempt to win the war before the fresh American troops could arrive in force. The spring offensive started well, and the German troops made great advances. But the offensive eventually sputtered out, and the Allied forces, now stronger than ever, launched their own counterattack. It was during this period of retreat that Hitler faced his final crisis of the war. In October 1918, near the town of Werwick in the Ypres sector, British forces unleashed a heavy mustard gas attack. This was a horrifying new weapon. The gas was invisible, but it would burn any skin it touched and destroy the lungs of anyone who inhaled it. Hitler and his fellow soldiers were caught out in the open. As the green-yellow cloud rolled towards them, they frantically tried to put on their gas masks. Hitler later wrote that the air around them turned into a burning yellow fire, and he could feel his eyes starting to scream in pain. He was carried to a field hospital, where he and other gassed soldiers lay in rows. Their eyes were swollen shut and covered with heavy bandages. Hitler was temporarily blind, a terrifying and helpless condition. His world was now one of constant pain, a burning sensation in his eyes and throat, and the sound of his comrades coughing and groaning around him. He later claimed that during this period, he had a vision, that he was told he must save Germany. This is almost certainly a lie he created later for political purposes, a story to make his rise to power seem like a divine mission. But the reality of his situation, blind, in pain, in a hospital, knowing that the Germany he had adored was about to lose the war, was a powerful psychological shock. On November 11, 1918, as Hitler lay in the Pacewalk Military Hospital, a pastor came and told the wounded soldiers the news that they dreaded most. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. For Hitler, the news was like a bolt of lightning. He felt like his entire world had been destroyed for the second time. He had given 4 years of his life, his health, and his comrades to a cause that was now lost. The camaraderie, the purpose, and the structure he had finally found in the army were gone. He was no longer a soldier. He was once again a failed, unemployed artist with no home and no future. He later claimed that at that exact moment, as he lay blind and weeping on his bed, the decision that would change the world was made. The hatred that had been building inside him for years finally found its focus. He blamed the defeat on everyone but the soldiers, on the politicians, on the anti-war groups at home, and above all on the Jews. In his mind, Germany hadn't been defeated on the battlefield. It had been stabbed in the back at home by an unfaithful government and foreign enemies. The logic of his life, which had led him into the trenches as a salvation, now led him out of them as a man possessed by a new and dangerous mission. He was going to enter politics and, as he later wrote, correct the mistake of 1918. The First World War didn't just give him a purpose. It gave him a world view, a style of leadership, and a hunger for a kind of absolute power that would soon pull the rest of the world into an even greater darkness. The war was over. Germany was defeated, humiliated, and broken. The year 1919 found Munich, the capital of Bavaria, in a state of absolute chaos. Red revolutionaries fought in the streets against right-wing paramilitary groups known as the Free Corps Freikorps. Buildings were scarred by bullets, and the economy was collapsing. The old order of the Kaiser was gone, replaced by the shaky, weak Weimar Republic. For the soldiers returning from the front, like Adolf Hitler, the country they came back to was unrecognizable. It was not the proud Germany they had fought for. It was a land of hunger, unemployment, and anger. Hitler, still technically a soldier in the army, was adrift, without a trade or a clear future. However, he soon found a new purpose in this very chaos. Hitler was assigned by the army's intelligence department to monitor the various political groups that were popping up everywhere in Munich. He was sent as an observer to a meeting of a tiny group called the German Workers' Party, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or DAP. He expected a significant communist meeting, but what he found was a handful of men, mechanics, small business owners, and workers, discussing disorganized ideas of nationalism and anti-Semitism in a dark backroom. He was unimpressed until a speaker proposed that Bavaria break away from the rest of Germany. Hitler's anger erupted. He stood up and launched into a passionate, furious rebuttal. The crowd was stunned into silence by this unknown man with the strange, powerful energy. The party leaders, recognizing a unique talent, immediately asked him to join. In a decision that would change history, he accepted. This small, dark beer hall was where Hitler discovered his defining power. He was not an organizer or a thinker. He was a master orator. He found that when he spoke, he was not just communicating. He was acting like a shaman for a wounded nation. He began to speak regularly, first to 20 people, then to 100, then to 1,000. The people who listened to him were not from the wealthy elite. They were forgotten men, unemployed veterans, and small business owners who felt betrayed by the democratic system. To them, he was not a politician. He was a prophet who understood their deep anger and their shame. He took their confused resentment and gave it a target. He blames the November criminals, the politicians who had signed the surrender, and he blamed the Jewish people, connecting them with both international finance and communism. His speeches were not logical arguments. They were dramatic performances, full of long build-ups, explosions of fury, and promises of a glorious, disciplined rebirth. His voice, with its deep, booming tone and sudden, high-pitched screams, commanded attention. He studied the psychology of the masses and learned that simplicity, repetition, and emotion were far more powerful than complex reasoning. He quickly took total control of the tiny DAP. In 1920, he renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or NSDAP, which people would soon call the Nazi Party. He created the party's symbols, the ancient swastika in a white circle on a blood-red flag. Red was chosen to compete with the communists and attract workers. The swastika, a common Aryan symbol, represented the struggle of the Aryan race. This flag became a potent force, a sacred object. To protect his meetings and break up rival communist gatherings, he formed the Sturmabteilung SA, or Storm Troopers. These were young men, often unemployed thugs and veterans, dressed in brown shirts and armbands, who brought organized violence to Munich's political scene. They marched in disciplined columns, carrying the swastika banners, and creating an image of order in a disordered city. By 1921, Hitler was the absolute leader, the Führer, of a growing and dangerous force. The party was no longer a club. It was a paramilitary organization with a clear goal: to overthrow the weak Weimar democracy. The situation in Germany worsened to a catastrophic point in 1923. The hyperinflation became so extreme that money was literally worthless. Piles of cash were used by children for toys. Workers were paid multiple times a day so they could rush to the store before their wages became valueless. Savings disappeared overnight. The French army had also occupied the industrial Ruhr region to force reparation payments, crushing German national pride. In Bavaria, the right-wing state government, led by Gustav von Kahr, despised the central government in Berlin and was on the verge of rebellion. Hitler saw this as his moment. He saw the misery and the rage of the German people, and he believed the conditions were perfect for a revolution. He was no longer content to be a speaker. He wanted to be the leader who would march on Berlin, just like Mussolini had marched on Rome. He decided he would force Kahr and the other Bavarian leaders to join him in a national revolution. The place chosen for this move was the Böhmischer Braukeller, one of Munich's massive, cavernous beer halls, where hundreds could gather for beer and politics. On the evening of November 8, 1923, Kahr was giving a speech to a crowd of Bavarian notables. The hall was full of people in suits and uniforms, the air thick with the smell of beer and tobacco smoke. Suddenly, the SA, armed with rifles and machine guns, surrounded the building. Hitler, dressed in a slightly too big black tailcoat and wearing his Iron Cross, strode down the center of the hall, flanked by his bodyguards. The crowd was paralyzed with confusion and fear. He jumped onto a table, drew a pistol, and fired a shot into the ceiling to demand silence. He announced that the national revolution had begun and that the Bavarian government was deposed. This was not a negotiation, it was a coup. Hitler was not a calm, cold leader in this critical moment. He was a man of intense, chaotic emotion. Kahr and other leaders were forced into a back room. Hitler, pacing and agitated, demanded they join him as ministers in his new national government. He screamed, "I have 3 bullets, one for each of you if you do not join, and the last for myself." He believed he was acting as Germany's savior. He then left the room to speak to the main crowd in the hall, giving a speech of such dramatic power that he won them over. He spoke of Germany's humiliation and the glory that would come. When he returned to the back room, General Ludendorff, the legendary war hero, had arrived. With Ludendorff's help, the Bavarian leaders, facing death and under extreme pressure, reluctantly agreed to support Hitler's revolution. Hitler returned to the main stage and announced a joint government with Ludendorff and Kahr. The crowd in the beer hall was ecstatic, singing the national anthem. For a few short hours, Hitler believed he had won. This victory was a complete illusion. Kahr and the other leaders were not supporters. They were hostages who were looking for an opportunity to escape. Later that night, they were released on a promise of loyalty to the coup, which they immediately broke. Ludendorff, in his naive arrogance, had let them go, believing that the word of German officers was sacred. As soon as they were safe, Kahr denounced the madman Hitler and his attempted putsch. The police and the army units in Munich were ordered to crush the rebellion. Hitler's plans were collapsing all around him. The other key government buildings in Munich had not been secured. He had failed to win the support of the actual state power. He spent a sleepless night in the beer hall, his elation turning to desperate panic. He had risked everything on a single, bold move, and now he was facing the consequences. The next day, November 9, 1923, was cold and rainy. Hitler was desperate. He could not just sit in the beer hall and wait for the army to arrest him. Ludendorff, refusing to believe that the police would fire on him, suggested a desperate plan. They would march into the center of Munich and take power through the sheer force of their presence. Hitler agreed, hoping that the ordinary soldiers and policemen would refuse to shoot and would join them. It was his last gamble. Around noon, about 2,000 Nazis, a mix of uniformed SA and others, began their march from the beer hall toward the Odeonsplatz. Hitler and Ludendorff marched in the front rank, linked arm in arm with other leaders. They carried swastika flags and banners, trying to create an imposing show of force. The mood among the marchers was grim but determined. The procession made its way across the Ludwig Bridge and down the narrow Residenzstrasse, heading toward the majestic buildings surrounding the Odeonsplatz. As they passed the town hall, they were cheered by some crowds who shouted Heil. They were close to their goal, however, at the narrow end of the Residenzstrasse, just before it opens into the main square. A cordon of armed green-uniformed Bavarian police was waiting. The street was too narrow for the marchers to spread out. The two forces faced each other at point-blank range, a few meters apart. Ludendorff marched on, fully expecting the police to back down out of respect for him. What happened next was violent and sudden. Someone fired a shot. It was never clear which side it came from. In response, the police opened fire with a volley of volleys into the packed column of marchers. It was absolute chaos. Marchers scrambled for cover, falling and crushing each other. The man whose arm was linked with Hitler's, Max Erwin von Scheubner-Richter, was shot in the chest and killed instantly. As he fell, he dragged Hitler down with him. Hitler dislocated his shoulder, and he lay on the cold cobblestones, surrounded by the screaming and the dying. The firing lasted only a few minutes. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler, wounded, terrified, and failing in his mission, got to his feet. Flanked by his bodyguards, he fled the scene, pushing through the terrified crowd, leaving his followers behind to face the police and the dead. Ludendorff, in a moment of stoic courage, continued to march straight ahead into the police line and was arrested without resistance. The coup had miserably failed. The glorious revolution was over. Hitler was a fugitive, his world shattered by a shower of bullets on a Munich street. The steel door of Landsberg prison clanged shut with a heavy, final sound. For any other failed revolutionary in the Weimar Republic, this sound would have marked the end of their political dreams, the beginning of years of gray isolation and regret. For Adolf Hitler, however, entering Landsberg in 1924 was not the end. It was a strategic pause, a strange interlude that would be transformed, through propaganda and his own iron will, into the foundational myth of his movement. He was not treated as a common criminal or a dangerous traitor who had attempted to overthrow the government by force. Instead, the Bavarian authorities, many of whom secretly sympathized with his far-right nationalist views, treated him more like an honored, if slightly troublesome, political guest. His confinement was less a punishment and more a period of enforced rest in a comfortable, old-world fortress. Hitler was assigned a large, airy cell on the first floor. It was a room that felt more like a modest study in a provincial inn than a place of incarceration. The walls were painted a plain, clean color, and a large arched window looked out over the prison gardens and the small Lech River, letting in ample natural light. He was allowed to wear his own clothes, usually a neat suit or traditional Bavarian attire, rather than a prison uniform. He was not forced to perform labor. Most significantly, he was allowed almost unlimited correspondence and visitors. His cell became a bustling hub of Nazi activity. Loyal followers arrived daily, bearing gifts of food, flowers, and books, and carrying messages to the outside world. He was surrounded by a small, dedicated entourage of fellow Putschists who had been imprisoned with him, including his loyal, fanatical secretary, Rudolf Hess, and the hulking, roughneck Emil Morris, who acted as his chauffeur and bodyguard. For the first few weeks, Hitler settled into a routine of leisure and reflection. He answered the voluminous mail that poured in from all over Germany, much of it from women expressing their admiration and support. He read books on history, philosophy, and racial theory, further solidifying the fragmented ideas that had been swirling in his mind. But soon, the desire to act, to leave a lasting mark on the movement he had created, overcame him. He needed to explain the Putsch, to justify his actions, and most importantly, to codify the ideology of National Socialism into a definitive text. In the summer of 1924, in the quiet of his cell, the concept of Mein Kampf, my struggle, was born. He did not write the book in the traditional sense. Hitler was a man of the spoken word, a demagogue who thought in dramatic paragraphs and shouted slogans. He found the physical act of writing tedious and slow. Instead, he began to dictate the book, pacing the floor of his cell, channeling the energy of his beer hall speeches into the typed page. His faithful secretary, Rudolf Hess, sat at a small, cluttered wooden desk, a heavy, black mechanical typewriter in front of him. Hess was not merely a transcriber, he was a fanatical believer, hanging on every word Hitler spoke, absorbing the ideology with religious fervor. He would spend hours typing, sometimes gently suggesting improvements or clarifications, but mostly just capturing the torrent of Hitler's thoughts. The process of dictation was a strange, theatrical performance. Hitler would begin pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he spoke, his voice would rise, mirroring the cadences of his public oratory. He would gesture passionately, pounding his fist into his palm to emphasize a point, staring intently at the wall as if addressing a massive crowd in the Hofbrauhaus. He spoke about his childhood in Austria, his failure to become an artist in Vienna, and the awakening he experienced there regarding the Jewish peril and the Marxist threat. He spoke of the First World War as the greatest, most formative experience of his life, a time of pure, heroic sacrifice that was betrayed by politicians at home. He railed against the Treaty of Versailles, calling it a monstrous act of revenge that enslaved the German people. As the weeks turned into months, the core ideological pillars of National Socialism began to take shape on the typed pages. The book became a vessel for his fanatical worldview. He laid out his doctrine of social Darwinism, the idea that life is an eternal, brutal struggle for survival where only the strongest race can prevail. He argued that the world was divided into a hierarchy of races, with the Aryan race, of which the Germans were the finest example, at the very top, the creators of all human culture and progress. He claimed that this master race was engaged in a life-or-death struggle against the Jewish race, which he portrayed as a parasitic force, a corrupter of blood, and the secret, conspiratorial hand behind both international finance and communism. This racial poisoning, he argued, was the cause of all Germany's problems. From this doctrine of racial struggle came his terrifying plans for the future. He declared that Germany, to survive and thrive, needed more Lebensraum, or living space. He argued that this space could not be found in overseas colonies, which were a drain on national energy, but must be taken by force in the East. He specifically targeted Russia and its vassal states, arguing that the land was destined for German settlement, and that the Slavic people living there were racially inferior and must be subjugated or expelled. This plan for imperial conquest, laid out with chilling clarity in Landsberg, would become the blueprint for World War II. But Mein Kampf was not just a textbook of hatred and conspiracy. It was also a brilliant, if deceitful, exercise in personal myth-making. Hitler understood the power of a powerful, central narrative. He carefully edited the events of his own life to create the image of a destined leader, a man who had suffered poverty and obscurity, only to be called by Providence to save Germany in its hour of greatest need. He transformed the beer hall Putsch, which was in reality a chaotic and humiliating failure, into a moment of heroic sacrifice. He spoke of the 16 party members who had died as martyrs, whose blood had consecrated the soil of Munich. He presented his imprisonment not as a defeat, but as a period of necessary reflection and sacrifice, a time when he, like other great leaders before him, had been forced into the wilderness to prepare for his ultimate mission. This process of writing also allowed Hitler to come to a critical, strategic realization. He recognized that the age of violent coups, of marching on city halls with armed paramilitaries, was over. The state, however weak the Weimar Republic might appear, still possessed the power to crush any armed uprising. He decided on a new, more insidious path to power. He would not destroy democracy from the outside. He would use the rules of democracy to destroy it from within. He would reorganize the Nazi Party, create a nationwide network of cells, and participate in elections. He would seek to win the hearts and minds of the German people through massive propaganda and public spectacles, and once he had gained power legally, he would dismantle the Republic and establish his dictatorship. This strategic shift, formulated in Landsberg, was the key to his future success. Life in Landsberg was not solely focused on ideology and writing. Hitler maintained a disciplined, almost ascetic routine. He ate simply, rarely touched meat, and never drank alcohol or smoked. He spent time in the prison garden, taking short walks and observing the other prisoners from a distance. He received a constant stream of visitors, from high-ranking party officials to curious admirers, further feeding his growing sense of importance. These visits kept him connected to the outside world and ensured that he remained the undisputed leader of the party, even from behind bars. As his time in prison neared its end, Hitler worked to refine the manuscript. The text was sprawling, repetitive, and written in a turgid, complex style, but its raw ideological power was undeniable. Mein Kampf was a comprehensive declaration of war against the liberal, multicultural world. It was a book written by a man who had spent his life on the fringes of society and was now prepared to reshape that society in his own terrifying image. When it was finally published, it was not an immediate bestseller. Many found its style difficult and its ideas too extreme, but for his fanatical followers it was a Bible, a sacred text that provided them with a shared language, a clear enemy, and a powerful sense of mission. Hitler was released in December 1924 after serving less than a year of his sentence. He walked out of Landsberg a changed man. He was no longer just a talented beer hall agitator. He was a published author, an ideologue with a comprehensive plan for national redemption, and a leader who had successfully weathered a crisis. He had been given a period of forced rest and had used it to build the foundation for his future dictatorship. He left the prison not as a humbled or broken man, but with a renewed and terrifying sense of his own infallibility. He was armed with a written manifesto that would, within a decade, become the official doctrine of a powerful European state and lead the world into the greatest catastrophe in human history. The struggle he wrote about in Landsberg was about to begin in earnest. After his release from Landsberg prison, Adolf Hitler faced a political landscape that had changed significantly since his failed coup attempt in 1923. The Weimar Republic, once on the brink of collapse, had stabilized. The German mark was steady, the economy was improving, and the extreme nationalism that had fueled Hitler's early rise seemed to be fading. However, Hitler was a changed man. His time in prison had not broken him, it had focused him. He had realized that power could not be seized by force alone. He had formulated a new strategy. He would work within the democratic system he despised, using the tools of democracy, elections, propaganda, and political parties to destroy it from within. His first task was to rebuild the Nazi Party, NSDAP, which had fallen into disarray during his imprisonment. He did this with meticulous care, modeling the party on the hierarchical structure he had envisioned in his manifesto. He demanded absolute loyalty from his followers, establishing himself as the undisputed Führer, leader, whose word was law. He created a shadow state with departments for agriculture, economy, race, and propaganda. He also reorganized the SA Sturmabteilung, or Storm Detachment, his paramilitary wing. While their primary role remained street violence and intimidating opponents, Hitler now insisted they also serve as a visible presence at rallies and parades, projecting an image of strength and discipline. But a well-organized party was not enough. Hitler needed a message that would resonate with the German people, and he needed a crisis to make them listen. The message was already formulated in Mein Kampf: extreme nationalism, virulent anti-Semitism, and the promise of a revitalized Germany that would regain its place as a world power. The crisis arrived in October 1929 with the collapse of the U.S. stock market, triggering the Great Depression. The impact on Germany, which was heavily dependent on American loans, was catastrophic. Businesses failed, banks collapsed, and unemployment skyrocketed. Millions of Germans found themselves plunged into poverty and despair. This economic catastrophe provided the perfect breeding ground for extreme politics. Germans, disillusioned with the mainstream parties that seemed unable to solve the crisis, began looking for radical solutions. Hitler stepped into this void, presenting himself not just as a politician, but as a savior. His propaganda machine, now under the brilliant and ruthless direction of Joseph Goebbels, went into overdrive. Goebbels understood the power of modern technology and simple, emotionally charged messages. The Nazis utilized every available medium: newspapers, posters, film, and most importantly, the radio. They plastered German towns with bold, striking posters that promised work and bread, and blamed Jews and Marxists for the country's misfortunes. Goebbels also made masterly use of film, producing documentaries that idealized Hitler and the Nazi movement. Hitler's campaign style was as innovative as his propaganda. He crisscrossed Germany by airplane, a highly modern method of travel at the time, appearing at multiple rallies in a single day. These events were masterfully choreographed spectacles of light, sound, and movement. Great torchlight processions would wind through the streets, accompanied by martial music and chanting SA men. The rallies themselves were held in massive, packed halls or stadiums, dominated by huge swastika banners. Hitler would appear amidst a fanfare of trumpets, building his speech to a crescendo of shouting and dramatic gestures. He was a hypnotic speaker, capable of connecting with the anger and fear of his audience, transforming their despair into a fanatic devotion to him and his cause. He promised to rip up the Treaty of Versailles, crush communism, and restore German greatness. He didn't offer a detailed economic plan. He offered hope and a sense of belonging to a national community, Volksgemeinschaft, that excluded the enemies he identified. The Nazi electoral strategy was surprisingly successful. In the 1930 Reichstag elections, they increased their number of seats from 12 to 107, becoming the second largest party. This success was not based on any specific policy proposals, but on a vague promise of national renewal that appealed to a wide range of voters. The unemployed, small business owners, farmers, and nationalists who felt humiliated by the loss of the First World War. The Weimar Republic, meanwhile, was in a state of political paralysis. No single party could form a stable majority, and governments rose and fell in rapid succession. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging and conservative war hero, was forced to govern by emergency decree, further undermining the democratic process. Hitler continued to build momentum. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazis doubled their seats, becoming the largest party in the Reichstag with 230 seats. But they still lacked an absolute majority, and Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, famously dismissing him as the Bohemian corporal. The Nazis, however, were not deterred. They blocked every attempt to form a coalition, ensuring the political deadlock continued. They also increased their use of political violence. SA men regularly clashed with their communist rivals in the streets, creating an atmosphere of fear and chaos that made many Germans long for a strong leader who could restore order. While Goebbels masterminded the public campaigns, Hitler engaged in complex backroom intrigues with Germany's conservative elite. These men, politicians, industrialists, and aristocrats, despised the Weimar Republic just as much as Hitler, but they also feared the Nazis' radicalism. They were also deeply concerned about the rising power of the communists. The conservative politicians, led by the ambitious former Chancellor Franz von Papen, believed they could use Hitler's popularity to their own advantage. They hatched a plan to appoint Hitler as Chancellor, but to surround him with a conservative cabinet that would control him. They argued that Hitler's radicalism would be tamed by the responsibilities of office, and that they would be able to tame him. Papen confidently predicted that they would have Hitler pushing them into a corner so hard he would squeak within 2 months. This was a colossal miscalculation. After weeks of maneuvering and negotiation, Hindenburg, old and exhausted, finally relented. He was assured by Papen and others that appointing Hitler was the only way to resolve the political crisis, and that they would be able to keep him in check. On January 30, 1933, in a simple ceremony, Adolf Hitler took the oath of office as Reich Chancellor. He was now, legally, the head of the German government. For the conservatives, it was a moment of cynical triumph, a clever maneuver that they believed would consolidate their own power. But for Germany and the world, it was the start of a nightmare. That very evening, the Nazis celebrated their victory with a massive spectacle that was to become a recurring theme of the Third Reich. Thousands of SA and SS men, carrying torches, marched in a great procession from the Brandenburg Gate down the Wilhelmstrasse, passing the Chancellery where Hitler stood at a window, watching. A radio broadcast conveyed the event to the entire nation. It was an ominous spectacle, the lights from the torches casting long, flickering shadows on the buildings, the air filled with the sound of marching boots and the chanting of Sieg Heil. The march projected a sense of unstoppable force and of a new era dawning. It was a visual representation of the Nazi ascent to power, a democratic trap that had worked perfectly. They had used the tools of the Weimar Republic to enter its halls of power, and now they stood ready to destroy it. The celebration was a victory parade, but it also felt like an occupation. The dark shadows cast by the torches that night were a chilling premonition of the terror and destruction that Hitler's dictatorship would soon unleash upon Germany and the world. The democratic experiment of the Weimar Republic had failed, not just because its enemies were strong, but because its supporters were weak and divided, and because men like Papen had fatally underestimated the fanatical ambition of the man they thought they could control. The year 1933 did not just bring Adolf Hitler legally to power. It was the year he broke German democracy and replaced it with a system of absolute fear. To the casual observer in January, Hitler was just another chancellor leading a weak, coalition government. The conservative politicians around President Paul von Hindenburg truly believed they could use Hitler's popularity for their own ends, and then push him aside when his usefulness ran out. They were wrong. Hitler had spent years planning how to dismantle the Weimar Republic, and he was not about to become anyone's puppet. He understood something his opponents did not. Power was not just about winning seats in parliament. It was about controlling the police, the narrative, and the very air people breathed. Within days of his appointment, the process of transformation, what the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, coordination, began, turning Germany from a republic into a vast, silent prison. The first step was to crush his most dangerous enemies, the Communist Party, KPD, and the Social Democrats, SPD. Hitler needed a perfect reason to act, a crisis that would frighten the public enough to accept extreme measures. He didn't have to wait long. On the evening of February 27, 1933, the unthinkable happened. The Reichstag building, the home of German democracy, went up in flames. The sky over Berlin was bright red as fire ripped through the iconic structure, destroying the main chamber. This was not just a fire, it was a political earthquake. The police captured a young, disturbed Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe at the scene, claiming he was the culprit. For Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, his brilliant but evil propaganda minister, this was a golden opportunity. Before the fires were even out, Goebbels began spreading the lie that this was not the act of a lone arsonist, but the start of a bloody communist revolution designed to throw Germany into chaos. Goebbels utilized the newspaper and radio, now under Nazi pressure, to scream this warning to the German people. Hitler wasted not a single second. The very next day, February 28, Hitler stood before President Hindenburg. Hindenburg, an aging, conservative military man who despised communism, was terrified of the uprising Hitler described. He agreed to Hitler's demands. Together, they signed the Reichstag Fire Decree, formerly known as the Decree of the Reich President for the Protection of People and State. This single document changed Germany forever. It was temporary in name, but in practice, it signaled the end of freedom. With a stroke of a pen, Hitler suspended all key civil liberties of the Weimar Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right of people to gather peacefully in groups, and the right to privacy, like the secrecy of letters and phone calls, were all vanished. The government now had the legal power to arrest anyone, at any time, without a real reason and hold them indefinitely. They could listen to any phone call and shut down any newspaper that criticized them. Democracy was effectively dead, though it would take a few more months to bury it completely. The first impact of the decree was a massive, violent wave of terror against the left. The SS Schutzstaffel and the SA Sturmabteilung, who had been harassing opponents for years, were now practically auxiliary police. They didn't need to fear the law, they were the law. Within days, thousands of communist politicians, union leaders, writers, and organizers were arrested. Hermann Goering, who controlled the Prussian police, proudly declared that his job was not to be objective, but to destroy his enemies. The official prisons were completely overwhelmed. They could not hold the thousands being swept up in the Nazi nets. This logistic problem forced the Nazis to create a terrifying new system. They needed places to isolate and punish their opponents far away from public view. These places were the first concentration camps. Dachau, located on the grounds of an abandoned munitions factory near Munich, was the first official, permanent camp, opened in March 1933. Dachau wasn't a death camp yet. Its original purpose was re-education through brutal labor and extreme psychological torture. Prisoners, initially mostly political opponents, were forced into uniforms, had their heads shaved, and were subjected to a life of cruelty designed to break their will. Heinrich Himmler, the rising star of the SS who would later manage the entire Holocaust, took control of Dachau and established it as the model for all future camps. The very name, Dachau, soon became a whisper of fear throughout Germany. People learned that if they spoke out against Hitler, they might disappear there. This silence was the first layer of Nazi terror. As the political opposition was being broken, Hitler also worked to achieve absolute legal power within the parliament. On March 23, 1933, the parliament, now mostly filled with Nazis or people intimidated into cooperation, met to vote on the Enabling Act, formally, the law to remedy the distress of people in Reich. This act would give Hitler's cabinet the power to pass laws, even those that went against the Constitution, without the consent of Parliament or the President for a period of 4 years. It was a suicide bill for German democracy. To pass a constitutional change, Hitler needed a 2/3 majority. The communists were already gone, locked away in prisons in Dachau. The center parties were weak and afraid. Only the Social Democrats (SPD) stood firm against him. The meeting was held in a makeshift venue, the Kroll Opera House, because the Reichstag was still a burned shell. The atmosphere was terrifying. The building was surrounded by massive crowds of SA men chanting, "We want the bill, or there will be fire." Inside, the corridors were lined with SA and SS troops, staring at the opposition members with open hostility. Hitler's speech to the deputies was relatively calm, promising that this was only a temporary measure to deal with the national crisis. It was Social Democrat leader Otto Wels who gave a historic speech that day, one that required immense courage. He spoke from a stage where no other party dared, directly in front of the Nazi leadership. At this historic hour, Wels said, "We Social Democrats subscribe to the principles of humanity and justice, of freedom and socialism." He told Hitler that they would vote no because no enabling act could give a dictator the right to destroy ideas. The Nazis were furious. Hitler ran back to the podium and screamed that Wels' people were the cause of all Germany's problems and that their time was up. When the vote was cast, it was 441 in favor, only 94 all Social Democrats against. Parliament had effectively voted itself out of existence. Hitler now was a dictator, no longer dependent on a divided parliament or a frail president to govern. With this new power, the process of coordinated terror accelerated. In April, a state-sponsored boycott of Jewish businesses was organized, followed by the first law that barred Jewish people from jobs in the civil service. In May, trade unions were banned, their offices were raided, and their leaders were sent to the camps. This left the Social Democrats utterly isolated. In June 1933, they too were officially banned as enemies of the state. One by one, every other political party in Germany either dissolved itself to avoid being banned or saw its leadership flee the country. On July 14, 1933, a new law declared that the NSDAP Nazi Party was the only legal political party in Germany. Anyone trying to keep another party alive was threatened with harsh prison terms. Germany was now a one-party state, just 6 months after Hitler became Chancellor. Hitler next moved to eliminate any organization that could act as a rival source of authority. This included independent youth groups, women's clubs, and teachers' associations. All were closed down and replaced by Nazi versions like the Hitler Youth and the German Labor Front. Freedom was disappearing from every corner of society. This constant pressure created a new reality, the Gestapo, the secret state police. Founded by Göring in April 1933 and later taken over by Himmler, the Gestapo was a police force that operated above the law. Their job was political intelligence and eliminating threats. They did not need a judge's warrant to make an arrest. They didn't need evidence. Anyone suspected of disloyalty was taken to their headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse 8 in Berlin, now the site of the Topography of Terror exhibit, where torture was routine. The true power of the Gestapo, however, was not just their cruelty, but the paranoia they created. Because they relied on ordinary citizens to inform on each other, people became afraid to speak frankly even with their own family or friends. A simple joke about the Nazi regime, if reported, could mean vanishing into a camp. This was the second layer of consolidated terror, the fear that the person next to you was watching. Yet, despite this total control of the public, an unexpected threat was growing from within Hitler's own party. The threat came from the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the original paramilitary force of the Nazi Party. Known as the Brownshirts for their distinctive uniforms, the SA had over 4 million members, making it far larger than the entire regular German army. Their leader was Ernst Röhm, a coarse, brutal old soldier who had been one of Hitler's earliest and closest allies. The SA had been essential in the years of fighting for power, using their fists to control the streets, intimidate opponents, and disrupt rival meetings. But now that Hitler was in power, the SA felt left out. Röhm wanted a second revolution. He argued that the revolution hadn't gone far enough. He wanted to replace the traditional conservative officer corps of the regular army, the Reichswehr, with his own paramilitary forces, effectively putting himself at the top of the military. He also wanted to punish the wealthy industrialists and aristocrats, many of whom Hitler was now counting on for funding and support to rearm Germany. Röhm and the SA were becoming a massive problem for the Führer. Their undisciplined violence on the streets was embarrassing the government, and Röhm's ambitions were alarming the core institutions Hitler needed, the army and the president. Hindenburg and his generals made it clear that they would not tolerate Röhm, and that if Hitler didn't control his own thugs, the army might step in and declare martial law, effectively taking back control. Hitler knew that the regular army was the only force that could still stop him if it wanted to. He also knew he could not start a major war, his ultimate goal, without the support of the professional military and the industry. While this conflict was growing, Hitler's other key deputies, Göring and Himmler, the overall leader of the smaller, rival SS, were working hard to undermine Röhm. Himmler, in particular, saw the SA as a primitive, lower-class organization that was holding back his refined, racially pure SS. Göring and Himmler together provided Hitler with manufactured intelligence, claiming that Röhm and the SA leadership were planning to stage a violent coup to overthrow him. They fueled Hitler's paranoia, presenting him with a terrifying choice: eliminate Röhm, or lose the support of the very people he needed to achieve his grandest dreams of empire. The situation came to a crisis in June 1934. President Hindenburg was extremely frail, clearly nearing his end. Hitler knew that once the president died, he intended to merge the offices of Chancellor and President, making himself the Führer. He absolutely had to have the army's approval for this crucial move. In a secret meeting with the Army High Command, a deal was struck. The army would support Hitler as Hindenburg's replacement, provided he dealt once and for all with Röhm and the SA threat. Hitler made his choice. On the morning of Saturday, June 30, 1934, he launched the bloody purge that came to be known as the Night of the Long Knives. He personally flew to Munich and drove to a hotel in Bad Wiessee where Röhm and the SA leadership were attending a conference. This is where the long friendship ended with a brutal betrayal. The unsuspecting SA leaders were dragged out of their beds and arrested. Hitler himself confronted Röhm, a moment that must have been filled with years of shared secrets and complex emotion. The SS, now the dominant force, were given lists of names to execute. Hundreds of SA leaders were shot without a trial at Stadelheim prison in Munich and Lichterfelde Cadet School in Berlin. Rerham was taken to a prison cell and given a single pistol with one bullet, with an invitation to do the honorable thing. When he refused, shouting, "Let Adolf shoot me," he was executed by SS officers. But Hitler did not stop with just Rerham and the SA. Goebbels and Himmler used the purge as a convenient cover to settle other old scores and get rid of anyone else they disliked. They added names of people who were not SA members at all. Also executed was Kurt von Schleicher, Hitler's immediate predecessor as Chancellor, and his wife, both shot in their home. The elderly Gustav von Kahr, who had crushed Hitler's 1923 beer hall Putsch, was found hacked to death in a swamp. Franz von Papen, Hitler's conservative vice-chancellor who had foolishly believed he could control Hitler, barely survived because President Hindenburg personally intervened to save him, but many of his close aides were murdered. Gregor Strasser, an old Nazi rival who had tried to build a different version of the party, was also among the victims. When the slaughter was over, it was presented to the German public not as an act of violence, but as a necessary and brilliant move by the Führer to save Germany from a dangerous communist-led coup. Goebbels again controlled the newspapers and radio, broadcasting a detailed lie about Rerham's treason and his plans for violent takeover. On July 13, 1933, Hitler stood before a parliament that was now a mere decoration, and gave a speech justifying the mass murders. He famously declared, "In this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German nation, and was therefore the supreme judge of the German people." It was a public statement that the law was whatever he said it was. The night of the long knives completely changed the dynamic of Nazi power. The SA, though it still existed, was broken as a political force, its size reduced and its leadership terrified into silence. Its place was taken by Himmler's SS. The SS, once just a tiny bodyguard, now became the core organization of Nazi terror, controlling the concentration camps, the Gestapo, and soon the police. Their black uniforms, distinct from the SA brown, became the symbol of a new kind of systematic, professional brutality. The regular army, which had helped Hitler plan the purge, found themselves in a difficult position. They had gotten rid of Rerham, but in doing so, they had accepted the murder of their own predecessor, General von Schleicher, and they had officially acknowledged the SS as a powerful, autonomous, and legal authority that could ignore the courts. They had sold their long-term soul to Hitler for a short-term political victory, and from this moment, they were no longer a potential check on his power, but were implicated in his crimes. The final piece of the consolidated grip on power came just weeks later. On August 2, 1934, President Paul von Hindenburg died at his home in Neudeck at the age of 86. Hitler now moved to consolidate all key authority into his own hands. Before the president was even buried, Hitler had the parliament pass a law that merged the office of president and chancellor. But a law was not enough. He needed to secure the direct, personal loyalty of the only force in Germany that could still potentially threaten his rule: the military. Within hours of Hindenburg's death, every single soldier, sailor, and pilot in the German armed forces was forced to take a new, very different kind of oath of allegiance. Traditional oaths are taken to the country, to the Constitution, or to the state. This one was entirely personal. It began, "I swear by God this sacred oath that I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler." The soldiers were no longer swearing to serve Germany. They were swearing to obey one man, personally. The night of the long knives had proven that Hitler would kill even his closest friend to maintain that obedience. Every judge, every police officer, and every public official was required to take a similar personal oath. To refuse was to destroy your life and career. This was the final layer of terror, a voluntary surrender of conscience by the institutions of the state, binding them directly to the will of a dictator. By the end of August 1934, Adolf Hitler had achieved something no previous leader in German history ever had. He controlled the party, the parliament, the government, the law, and the police. He had the military under a personal oath, and he had eliminated any potential rival both inside and outside his party. Terror was no longer just an occasional tool. It was the entire system of governance. It was Dachau and the whispered fear, the Gestapo and the paranoia of the ordinary citizen, and the black uniforms of the SS, which represented an authority that answered to no law. German democracy was not just dead. It was buried deep under layers of fear, with a massive, permanent guard station on top, ensuring it would never rise again. Germany had passed from the Republic of Weimar to the dictatorship of consolidated terror, ready to be molded to the singular, destructive will of its Führer. The landscape of Germany was changing, both physically and psychologically. By the mid-1930s, the brutal consolidation of power was complete, and the Nazi regime shifted its focus to reinforcing its control through a mixture of spectacular propaganda, economic revitalization, and systemic terror. This period was defined by a meticulously constructed illusion, the image of a unified, prosperous, and powerful Germany led by a visionary Führer, a grand spectacle designed to hide the terrifying reality of a totalitarian police state preparing for war. At the heart of this grand illusion were the Nuremberg rallies, officially known as the Reich Party Days, Reichsparteitage. These were not merely political meetings. They were massive, secular religious festivals designed to produce absolute worship of Adolf Hitler. Hitler understood that logic rarely moved mass crowds, but emotion, specifically pride, fear, and shared identity, could be easily manipulated. He tasked Albert Speer, his favorite architect and rising star in the Nazi hierarchy, with creating the physical setting for these spectacles. Speer designed the Zeppelin Field Stadium in Nuremberg on a scale that dwarfed the individual. It was a massive structure capable of holding hundreds of thousands of people. Its most famous feature, however, was not stone or concrete, but light. Speer created the Cathedral of Light, Lichtum, by positioning 130 anti-aircraft searchlights at intervals around the field, pointing them vertically into the night sky. The beams converged high above the stadium, creating massive pillars of light that visible for many miles. This surreal, imposing architecture of light made the attendees feel as though they were part of something divine and invincible. The rallies themselves were masterpieces of choreography. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the SA marched in perfect symmetry, their boots creating a rhythmic, hypnotic thunder on the pavement. The swastika flag was everywhere, draped from towers, carried by marchers, and hanging in vast backdrops. Hitler, usually dressed in his simple brown party uniform, would arrive late, his presence signaled by fanfares. He would walk down a vast central aisle, flanked by his highest officials, Speer among them, soaking in the adulation. His speeches, broadcast across the grounds by massive speaker systems, were masterpieces of dynamic delivery, moving from calm tones to screaming crescents that drove the crowd into a frenzy of belief. These rallies were expertly filmed by Leni Riefenstahl. Her documentary, Triumph of the Will, commissioned by Hitler himself, utilized revolutionary filmmaking techniques, moving cameras, telephoto lenses, and majestic wide shots to create the ultimate propaganda masterpiece. The film did not just document the rally, it elevated Hitler to the status of a god descending from the clouds to lead the German people. These spectacles sold the idea of a cohesive Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community unified in thought and action, erasing individuality and critical thought in favor of collective obedience. Parallel to this psychological mobilization, the regime focused on reinforcing the illusion of economic recovery. The devastating unemployment of the Weimar era was rapidly disappearing, seemingly fulfilling Hitler's promises. The primary driver of this recovery was invisible to the public: massive deficit spending for rearmament. The economy was being violently oriented toward military production. Steel factories, airplane plants, and shipyards were running around the clock, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. The German people saw only the new factories and the fuller paychecks, unaware that the nation's wealth was being transformed into weapons of future destruction. The most famous public symbol of this economic rebirth was the construction of the Reichsautobahn. This vast network of modern, multi-lane highways was heavily promoted as the Führer's gift to the working man, a revolutionary project connecting the nation and providing jobs for the unemployed. Propaganda photos always showed Hitler with a silver shovel, happily initiating the construction of a new segment. The public was sold the promise of the Volkswagen, the people's car, a reliable and affordable vehicle that every German family would soon own. Millions joined the Strength Through Joy, Kraft durch Freude, or KDF, organization, a state-run agency that provided subsidized leisure activities, theater tickets, sports events, and even affordable cruises on purpose-built ships. This program was designed to convince the working class that the state cared deeply for their well-being, effectively buying their loyalty. However, the illusion of public prosperity and unity was maintained only through the omnipresent reality of the Gestapo. While the majority of Germans, distracted by economic improvements and propaganda spectacles, remained compliant, the regime quietly targeted anyone who did not conform. The secret state police, Geheime Staatspolizei, led with terrifying efficiency by Reinhard Heydrich under Heinrich Himmler's ultimate control, operated above the law. Their networks of informants were vast, listening in factories, offices, and even apartment buildings. The simple act of telling a joke about Hitler or expressing doubt about the regime was enough to disappear into a concentration camp like Dachau, which was constantly being expanded. This created a profound, quiet terror. Society was unified not just by pride, but by an efficient, hidden machinery of repression that silenced dissent before it could begin. The darkest reality hidden by the grand illusion was the systematic escalation of racial persecution. While Germany projected an image of modernity and progress to the world, it was simultaneously defining its own citizens as legal outcasts based solely on their ancestry. The culmination of this occurred in 1935 with the introduction of the infamous Nuremberg laws. These racist statutes were officially proclaimed during the annual rally itself. The Nuremberg laws included the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which criminalized marriage and sexual relationships between Jews and citizens of German or kindred blood. The second statute, the Reich citizenship law, defined citizens not by residence but by heredity. Only those with pure German or kindred blood could be citizens. All others, primarily Germany's Jewish population, were stripped of citizenship and defined as subjects of the state, rendering them stateless within their own country. The laws provided the legal foundation for systemic discrimination, forcing Jews out of professions, the military, and public life. Every German citizen was required to prove their Aryan ancestry, a process that normalized racial ideology in daily bureaucracy. This duality, grand public progress hiding systematic internal persecution, was expertly managed when Germany hosted the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin. This was the regime's greatest propaganda opportunity, a chance to showcase the new Germany to the entire international community. The world was watching, and Hitler understood that the games must be a flawless advertisement for his regime. Berlin was meticulously cleaned up. The brutal anti-Semitic signs and propaganda usually visible on every street corner were quietly removed. Persecution was temporarily halted, and the Gestapo was ordered to remain discreet. The games themselves were a masterpiece of organization, surpassing all previous Olympics. Hitler commissioned Speer to design a massive, awe-inspiring stadium, a structure of modern efficiency and classical beauty. For the first time, the iconic torch relay from ancient Olympia was introduced, a powerful symbol linking the glory of ancient Greece directly to the Third Reich. Leni Riefenstahl was again commissioned to film the games. Her documentary, Olympia, was another technical masterpiece, introducing innovative ways to film athletic movement and celebrating the Aryan ideal of physical perfection, even while capturing the spectacular victories of the African-American athlete Jesse Owens, which publicly contradicted Nazi racial theories. The 1936 Olympics were an unprecedented success for the Nazi regime. Thousands of foreign journalists, tourists, and international dignitaries left Berlin impressed by the order, the prosperity, and the seemingly peaceful intentions of the German state. They had seen a nation of happy, unified people, advanced technology, and a powerful, visionary leader. They had not seen the concentration camps. They had not seen the military factories preparing for total war, and they had not met the people defined as non-citizens and outcasts. By the end of 1936, the grand illusion seemed absolute. The massive Nuremberg spectacles created a powerful sense of national identity and collective purpose. The economic recovery, built secretly on militarization, provided temporary prosperity. The Olympics had successfully projected a mask of civilization to the world. Germany was strong, unified, and dangerous, fully mobilized both industrially and psychologically. The grand illusion was a total success, not because it was true, but because both the German people and the world desperately wanted to believe it. The stage was set, not for enduring peace, but for the catastrophic fulfillment of Hitler's true and hidden ambitions. The mid-1930s saw Adolf Hitler solidify his absolute control over Germany, but his ambitions stretched far beyond the nation's existing borders. He looked at the map of Europe not as a fixed arrangement of sovereign states, but as a temporary puzzle waiting to be redrawn by a strong German hand. His primary foreign policy goal, clearly outlined in his earlier writings, was dual: the unification of all German-speaking peoples into one great German Reich, and the acquisition of vast Lebensraum, living space, in the East for the Aryan master race. To achieve this, he knew war was inevitable, but his initial strategy was masterfully deceptive. He spoke often of peace, portraying Germany as a victim of the harsh Treaty of Versailles, seeking only equality among nations. This rhetoric provided a convenient shield for his aggressive, step-by-step revision of the post-WWI order. His first major gamble came in March 1936, the remilitarization of the Rhineland. This territory, bordering France, had been designated a demilitarized zone by the Versailles Treaty to act as a buffer. Sending German troops across the Rhine was a direct violation and a clear casus belli act of war. Hitler's generals were terrified, knowing the German army was not yet strong enough to resist a French counterattack. Hitler, however, sensed the profound war weariness and political paralysis gripping both France and Britain. He gambled that they would not fight for a territory that was, after all, Germany's own backyard. His gamble paid off handsomely. French troops remained in their defensive Maginot Line, and Britain, treating the move as Germany simply reoccupying its own land, offered only diplomatic protests. This bloodless victory profoundly altered the balance of power. It proved to Hitler that the Western democracies lacked the will to enforce their own treaties. It also boosted his domestic popularity enormously, framing him as the bold leader who had broken the chains of Versailles, silencing his conservative military critics who had advocated caution. With the Rhineland secured, Hitler turned his focus toward his birthplace, Austria. The goal was Anschluss, unification. Austria was already struggling with political instability and a growing homegrown Nazi movement, covertly supported by Berlin. Early in 1938, Hitler began applying intense pressure on the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg. During an infamous meeting at Hitler's mountain retreat, the Berghof, Schuschnigg was subjected to a characteristic torrent of threats and intimidation. Hitler demanded that Austrian Nazis be given key government posts, effectively turning the country into a client state. Schuschnigg, in a desperate attempt to maintain Austrian independence, called for a national plebiscite vote on the issue. This act furious Hitler. He knew a fair vote might go against unification. He immediately demanded Schuschnigg's resignation and canceled the plebiscite, threatening a German invasion if his demands were not met. Schuschnigg, realizing no help was coming from the West, resigned. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border into Austria. This was not an invasion in the traditional sense. It was an orchestrated takeover. The German troops were greeted not with resistance, but with cheering crowds, flowers, and Nazi salutes. Austria ceased to exist as an independent state, becoming the province of Ostmark within the Third Reich. Hitler himself made a triumphant entry into Vienna, the city of his youthful rejections, addressing an ecstatic crowd from the balcony of the Hofburg Palace. He proclaimed the fulfillment of his oldest dream. Domestically, this was another massive triumph. Germany had grown without firing a shot, absorbing 7 million people and rich resources. Internationally, the Anschluss was met with resignation. Britain and France again offered only verbal condemnations, strictly adhering to a policy that would soon have a name: appeasement. This policy, championed most notably by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was rooted in a desperate desire to avoid another catastrophic world war at almost any cost, combined with a lingering belief that Germany had legitimate grievances that could be settled through negotiation. To Hitler, appeasement was simply a sign of fatal weakness. Having successfully swallowed Austria, Hitler immediately set his sights on his next target, Czechoslovakia. This country, a vibrant democracy created after WWI, presented a more complex challenge. It had a strong army and, unlike Austria, a fortified border and defensive alliances with France and the Soviet Union. Hitler's point of attack was the Sudetenland, a mountainous border region home to 3 million ethnic Germans. The region also contained Czechoslovakia's primary border fortifications and vital industries. Hitler ordered the local Sudeten German Party, led by Konrad Henlein, to make increasingly impossible demands on the Czechoslovak government in Prague, ensuring that no peaceful solution could be reached. He then launched a fierce propaganda campaign, portraying the Sudeten Germans as victims of Czech brutality and oppression, a narrative he used to justify German intervention. Throughout the summer of 1938, tensions escalated dramatically, pushing Europe to the very edge of war. This was the crisis that defined appeasement. Prime Minister Chamberlain, horrified by the prospect of war over a country of whom we know nothing, made 3 unprecedented personal trips to Germany to meet with Hitler in September 1938. Hitler, sensing his advantage, escalated his demands at each meeting. First, he demanded that areas with a majority German population be ceded. When the Czechs, under intense pressure from their British and French allies, reluctantly agreed, Hitler raised the stakes. He demanded the immediate military occupation of the Sudetenland by German troops and endorsed the territorial claims of Poland and Hungary against Czechoslovakia. The situation seemed hopeless. War appeared certain. Britain and France began mobilizing their forces, and Czechoslovakia prepared for a desperate defense. Then Mussolini, the Italian dictator, intervened at the last minute, proposing a four-power conference to find a peaceful solution. On September 29, 1938, the Munich Conference was convened. The leaders of Britain, Chamberlain; France, Edouard Daladier; Germany, Hitler; and Italy, Mussolini, met to decide the fate of a country that was not even invited to the table. Czechoslovakia was excluded from the discussions that would rip it apart. In the Grand Führerbau building in Munich, Chamberlain and Daladier, desperate to avoid war, essentially surrendered to almost all of Hitler's demands. The resulting Munich Agreement specified that German troops would occupy the Sudetenland in stages starting October 1st. An international commission would oversee plebiscites in other disputed areas, which never really happened as intended. The Czech government, betrayed and abandoned by its partners, was given a choice: accept the agreement and lose its vital defenses, or fight Germany alone. They chose survival over suicidal resistance. Chamberlain famously returned to London waving the agreement, declaring he had secured peace for our time. The Munich Agreement was a geopolitical catastrophe for the West and the ultimate victory for Hitler's strategy of bloodless conquest. He had dismembered Czechoslovakia without a fight. Germany gained Czechoslovakia's entire fortified border, leaving the rest of the country completely defenseless. Germany also inherited massive stockpiles of advanced Czech military equipment, significantly boosting its own rearmament program. For Hitler, the conference confirmed his profound contempt for the weak democratic leaders, especially Chamberlain, whom he viewed as a pathetic, umbrella-toting old man. He left Munich convinced that nothing could stop him. His belief in his own infallible political genius reached a fanatical level. He had gambled multiple times and won every single hand. The bloodless triumphs of 1936 and 1938 provided the psychological and material foundations for the bloody war that was to come. Hitler did not wait long to complete his work. Only 6 months after Munich, in March 1939, he broke his solemn promise to Chamberlain that the Sudetenland was his last territorial demand in Europe. He applied extreme pressure on the new Czech leadership, threatening the aerial destruction of Prague if they did not surrender. The defenseless Czech state collapsed. German troops marched into Prague, and Hitler established the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, effectively absorbing the rest of the Czech lands into the Reich. At the same time, Slovakia was encouraged to declare nominal independence as a subservient German puppet state. This act was crucial. It proved to the world that Hitler could not be trusted and that his goals went far beyond self-determination for ethnic Germans. Even Chamberlain was forced to admit that appeasement had failed. Britain and France finally drew a hard line, offering security guarantees to Hitler's next obvious target, Poland. The road to war was now clearly paved. Hitler, however, needed one final piece to fall into place before he could risk a major conflict. He was determined to avoid the strategic nightmare of Germany in WWI, a two-front war against France/Britain in the West and the Soviet Union in the East. He also needed to neutralize Poland without immediate Soviet interference. The solution was the most shocking and cynical political deal of the 20th century. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, Ideological archenemies who had spent years vilifying each other signed a non-aggression pact, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The public agreement was simple. The two countries promised not to attack each other for 10 years. But the pact contained a secret protocol that partitioned Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland was to be divided between them. This deal cleared the final obstacle for Hitler. He had neutralized the vast power of the Soviet Union, removed any fear of a two-front war, and gained a free hand to invade Poland, knowing that Britain and France, though they had offered guarantees, were strategically isolated and likely too weak to interfere effectively. War was no longer a risk. It was a matter of timing. The first day of September 1939 began with a terrifying noise over Poland. It was the sound of the Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, known as Stukas, screaming down from the sky. As the bombs fell, German tanks, the Panzers, crossed the border in massive columns. This was not the slow trench warfare of World War I. This was something new. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The plan was simple and brutal. Attack with overwhelming force, break through the lines quickly and cause complete confusion. Adolf Hitler sat in his special train, the Amerika, which served as his mobile headquarters. He was finally the war leader he had always dreamed of being. He watched the maps with excitement as the reports came in. Poland's courageous soldiers, often fighting on horseback, were no match for modern tanks and airplanes. They fought bravely, but they were quickly surrounded. At the same time, as part of Hitler's secret deal with Joseph Stalin, the Soviet army attacked Poland from the east. Caught between two giants, Poland fell in weeks. Hitler felt his vision was confirmed. Force, speed, and ruthlessness were the keys to history. He was, in his own mind, a military genius. After Poland, there was a period of quiet on the Western Front. People called it the phony war. But Hitler was not resting. He was planning. He knew that to secure his empire, he must defeat Germany's old enemy, France, and push the British off the continent. In the spring of 1940, the lighting struck again. First, German forces suddenly invaded Denmark and Norway in April. Denmark surrendered in hours. Norway fought longer with British help, but Hitler's forces soon controlled the vital coastline, securing iron ore supplies and bases for his navy. Then came May 10, 1940. This was the main event. Hitler unleashed Blitzkrieg on Western Europe. He sent his armies charging into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The world watched in horror. These neutral countries were overrun rapidly. The Netherlands, after the brutal bombing of Rotterdam, surrendered in just 5 days. The British and French armies rushed to meet the threat in Belgium. This was exactly what Hitler's generals wanted. The main German attack did not come through the flat lands of Belgium, where the Allies expected it. Instead, Hitler had approved a risky, brilliant plan. He sent his strongest tank divisions through the Ardennes forest in southern Belgium and Luxembourg. The Allied military leaders thought the Ardennes was impassable for tanks. They were wrong. The German panzers navigated the narrow forest roads with incredible speed. In a few days, they broke through the French lines at Sedan. The French soldiers, who had relied on their massive, stationary fortifications called the Maginot Line, were completely unprepared for this fast, mobile warfare. The panzers cut a path across France, reaching the coast of the English Channel. In one stroke, the main Allied armies in Belgium were trapped. It was a military catastrophe. The British Expeditionary Force and many French soldiers were pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk. They were stuck, with the sea behind them and German tanks closing in. Hitler, surprisingly, ordered his tanks to halt temporarily, giving the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, the task of finishing the enemy. This halt order remains a mystery, but it gave the British a desperate chance. They launched a miracle rescue, using military ships, fishing boats, and private yachts to evacuate over 330,000 soldiers from the beaches under constant German air attack. While a rescue, it was a major defeat. Britain lost all its heavy equipment, and the continent was left open to Hitler. With the British armies pushed back to their island, Hitler turned his attention south toward Paris. The French army, though large, was broken and confused. It was fighting a war from the past against a German army of the future. The French people began to flee their cities in millions, crowding the roads with carts and cars, desperate to escape the advancing panzers and the screaming Stukas. On June 14, 1940, German troops marched into Paris. The city, usually vibrant and full of life, was eerily quiet and mostly empty. German flags with the swastika were raised on the Eiffel Tower and other historic buildings. For Hitler, it was the proudest moment of his life. He visited the city briefly, posing for photos with the Eiffel Tower in the background, a tourist who had conquered the world's cultural capital. The boy from Braunau who failed to become an artist was now the master of Paris. The French government collapsed and was replaced by a new one led by the aged war hero, Marshal Philippe Pétain. He immediately asked for an armistice. Hitler received the news with almost childish joy. He jumped with excitement, a moment caught on film and shown to the German people. Hitler did not just want a surrender. He wanted complete humiliation for France. He remembered the shame of 1918, when Germany had to sign the armistice ending World War I. He ordered that the surrender of France take place in the exact same spot, the clearing in the Campigny forest, north of Paris. He even commanded that the original railway carriage, the one where the 1918 surrender was signed and which was now a museum piece, be brought to the forest. On June 22, 1940, Adolf Hitler arrived in Campigny. He sat in the carriage, in the same chair that the French leader Marshal Foch had used in 1918. He listened with visible satisfaction as the harsh surrender terms were read to the French delegation. The terms split France in two. The north and west coast were placed under direct German occupation, while the south would be run by Pétain's government, based in the town of Vichy. But Vichy France would still have to collaborate with Germany and pay massive costs. After the reading, Hitler left, his revenge complete. He had erased the shame of 1918 and conquered his greatest rival in just 6 weeks. The Blitzkrieg victories made Hitler incredibly popular at home. The German people, who had feared another long war like the first, were amazed by the speed and success of their army. Hitler seemed like a magician, a leader who could do no wrong. He promoted several of his top generals to the rank of field marshal during a grand ceremony in Berlin. He was at the absolute peak of his power. By the summer of 1940, Hitler controlled Europe from the border of Poland to the Pyrenees Mountains on the border of Spain, and from the North Cape of Norway to the central hills of France. Germany's industrial might was boosted by the factories of conquered nations. The wealth of Europe was being funneled to Berlin. Only one enemy remained in the West, Great Britain. Britain was an island protected by the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force RAF. Hitler believed that Britain was logically defeated and would soon ask for peace. But the British had a new leader, Winston Churchill, a man of fierce determination. He refused to even consider surrender. "We shall never surrender," Churchill declared to his people, and his resolve matched Hitler's own. Hitler began to draw up plans for an invasion of Britain, an operation called Sea Lion. But to invade, he first needed to control the skies over England. This led to the Battle of Britain, a long fight between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. All through the summer and autumn of 1940, the skies over southern England were filled with twisting air battles, as British Spitfires and Hurricanes fought off German bombers. In Berlin, Hitler sat with Goebbels, the propaganda minister, and Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, listening to reports. At first, the Luftwaffe attacked British airfields and radar stations. But in September, following a small British raid on Berlin, a furious Hitler changed tactics. He ordered Goering to stop attacking military targets and start bombing British cities, especially London. This became known as the Blitz. Night after night, German planes dropped bombs on London, Coventry, and other cities. Thousands of civilians were killed, and whole neighborhoods were destroyed. People spent their nights in underground stations, sleeping on platforms as the city burned above them. Hitler hoped this terror bombing would break the British spirit and force their government to make a deal. He was wrong again. Instead of breaking, the British spirit hardened. The bombing failed to destroy the RAF, and without control of the air, the invasion plan was too dangerous. By the autumn of 1940, the Battle of Britain was a defeat for Hitler. His dream of a total victory in the West was halted by the determination of the British people. The failure to conquer Britain did not discourage Hitler for long. In his mind, the main threat was not Churchill's island, but the Soviet Union in the East. He believed the British were holding on only because they hoped for an eventual alliance with the Russians. With the resources of all of Europe now at his command, his eyes turned back to his original fanatical goal, Lebensraum, living space in the East, and the total destruction of communism. Hitler felt that Blitzkrieg had worked everywhere else, and it would work against the Soviets too. He ordered his generals to begin planning for a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. He was confident that a quick, powerful blow would collapse the entire Soviet state in weeks. This decision, driven by his arrogance and racial ideology, would be the most significant turning point of the war. But in 1940, after the dramatic, lightning conquests of Poland, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, Adolf Hitler felt he was the master of destiny, a conqueror without equal in history, and he believed no power on earth could stop him. The summer of 1941 marked the beginning of Adolf Hitler's greatest gamble and his most catastrophic mistake. For years, inside the pages of Mein Kampf and in private conversations, he had spoken of his ultimate goal, Lebensraum, living space, in the East. To Hitler, the vast lands of the Soviet Union were not just territory. They were the essential resources Germany needed to become a self-sufficient world empire. He looked at the endless grain fields of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus, and saw the fuel for his thousand-year Reich. But this invasion was not merely strategic. It was fanatically ideological. Hitler viewed the war against the Soviet Union as an existential struggle between Germanic civilization and what he termed Judeo-Bolshevism. In his mind, this was a racial war of extermination, a war that allowed for no mercy and no negotiated peace. He was convinced that the Soviet system was weak, a giant with feet of clay, and that one powerful blow would cause the entire structure to collapse. He told his top generals, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." On the night of June 21, 1941, the German war machine, the most powerful mobile force the world had ever seen, was gathered along a massive border stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by Axis allies, waited in darkness. They had thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, the silence was shattered by the largest artillery barrage in history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The surprise was total. Despite numerous warnings from his own intelligence sources, and even Western powers, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had refused to believe that Hitler would break their pact so soon. The Soviet border troops were caught completely unprepared. German aircraft caught the Soviet Air Force on the ground, destroying hundreds of planes in the first few hours of the war. Luftwaffe bombers struck deep into Soviet territory, hitting communication hubs, supply depots, and mobilization centers. On the ground, panzer divisions ripped massive holes in the Soviet defensive lines, using the same Blitzkrieg tactics that had paralyzed France and Poland. The scale of the initial German victories was spectacular and terrifying. German panzer groups, led by brilliant commanders like Guderian and Hoth, raced ahead, encircling entire Soviet armies. In the first weeks of the campaign, at battles like Bialystok-Minsk and Smolensk, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were cut off, surrounded and forced to surrender. The German advance seemed unstoppable. Hitler, monitoring the progress from his new, isolated headquarters deep in the East Prussian forests, the Wolf's Lair Wolfschanz, was ecstatic. He believed the war was already won. His propaganda machine, led by Goebbels, trumpeted the news of unprecedented triumphs to the German public. The belief in Hitler's military genius reached its peak. He was no longer just the political leader of Germany. He was now viewed by many, and crucially by himself, as an infallible military commander-in-chief, whose intuition was superior to the careful planning of his professional generals. However, behind the headlines of massive triumphs, a dark and brutal reality was unfolding. This was not a gentleman's war like the campaign in France. From the very beginning, Barbarossa was waged with calculated ferocity. Hitler had issued precise criminal orders, such as the Commissar Order, which demanded the immediate execution of all captured Soviet political officers, commissars. The regular German army, the Wehrmacht, was drawn into this racial war, cooperating with special SS units known as the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads. As the German army advanced, the Einsatzgruppen moved in behind them, systematically rounding up and murdering Jews, suspected communists, and anyone deemed a partisan. Thousands of villages were burned to the ground, civilians were massacred. For the Soviet population, this was a war for survival, a reality Stalin used to rally the nation, calling it the Great Patriotic War. Hitler's brutal policy had a major unintended consequence. It turned potential allies, ethnic groups within the Soviet Union who hated Stalinism, into fierce enemies, fueling a massive partisan war that would plague German supply lines for years. As the summer turned to autumn, the relentless German advance began to slow. The sheer size of the Soviet Union began to work against the invaders. German supply lines were stretched dangerously thin, often trying to move across terrible roads that were little more than dirt tracks. The further east they went, the more resistance they met. Despite their massive losses, the Soviets showed an incredible ability to raise new armies. Factory workers labored around the clock, sometimes with the factories themselves being dismantled and moved eastward, out of reach of German bombers, to the Ural Mountains. Here, they produced tanks and planes at a rate that shocked German intelligence. The Blitzkrieg strategy relied on quick victory, but the Soviet Union refused to collapse. German soldiers were exhausted, their equipment was wearing out, and their units were severely under strength. The rapid advance had come at a high price in German blood. Then came the mud. In October, the autumn rains arrived, turning the unpaved Russian roads into seas of thick, sticky mud known as the Rasputitsa. The unstoppable panzer divisions were brought to a literal grinding halt. Supplies could not get forward, and the advance on Moscow, the central goal of the campaign, stalled. This enforced pause gave the Soviets precious time. Stalin, receiving reliable intelligence that Japan would not attack from the east, made the critical decision to transfer tough, well-equipped Siberian divisions to the defense of Moscow. These soldiers were specialists in winter warfare, and they were arriving just as the climate was about to change. Hitler, in his arrogance, had been so certain of a summer victory that he had not prepared the army for a winter campaign. The German soldiers were still in their summer uniforms. They had no winter clothing, no special lubricants for their weapons and vehicles that would operate in freezing temperatures, and no antifreeze for their engines. In mid-November, the ground finally froze, ending the mud season and allowing the German advance to resume. But now, they were fighting the clock. The German generals knew their troops were at the absolute limit, but Hitler demanded a final push for Moscow. German tanks got so close that officers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars, but that was as far as they would get. On December 5, 1941, the temperature plummeted to unprecedented levels, reaching -30 degrees Celsius and lower. The under-equipped German army froze. Soldiers died by the thousands from frostbite. Weapons jammed as oils froze solid. Tank engines could not be started. The German offensive had exhausted its final ounce of strength. The very next day, December 6, the Soviet army under General Georgy Zhukov unleashed a massive counteroffensive along the entire Moscow front. The Siberian divisions, equipped with skis, white camouflage, and weapons designed for the cold, smashed into the frozen, exhausted German lines. For the first time in the war, the German army was not just stopped. It was routed. Panic spread among the German troops as they were forced to retreat in the face of relentless Soviet attacks. Many generals, fearing the total destruction of their armies, advised a major withdrawal to safer defensive positions hundreds of miles to the west. But Hitler, safe in his distant headquarters, refused to listen. He had an absolute horror of retreat, believing it was a sign of weakness. Instead, he issued his famous halt order. He commanded the army to stand and fight exactly where they were, forbidding any retreat under any circumstances. Not one step back, he ordered. He believed that the willpower of the German soldier, inspired by Nazi ideology, could overcome any obstacle, including the Russian winter and the Soviet army. This decision was a turning point. On one hand, the halt order likely saved the German army from an immediate collapse and a disastrous, disorderly retreat that might have mirrored Napoleon's fate in 1812. The German lines held, in isolated pockets, throughout the brutal winter, buying time for the army to reorganize. But on the other hand, it consolidated Hitler's disastrous belief in his own infallible intuition over the advice of his professional military staff. From this point on, he deeply distrusted his generals, accusing them of cowardice and defeatism. He fired many of his most experienced commanders, including Guderian, the architect of Panzerwaffen, and Brauchitsch, the head of the army, and personally took over direct command of the Wehrmacht's operational decisions. He began making minute tactical choices from a distance, without any real understanding of the horrific conditions on the ground. The retreat from Moscow was the end of the Blitzkrieg in Russia. The dream of a quick, decisive victory in the East was dead. Germany was now locked into a war of attrition against a superior enemy with vastly more resources and manpower. The Operation Barbarossa, conceived in arrogance and ideological fanaticism, had ended in a strategic disaster. It had not kicked the rotten door down. It had instead kicked the beehive, awakening a powerful enemy that would not rest until the Nazi regime was destroyed. As the long, frozen winter of 1941 to 1942 continued, the first cracks appeared in the myth of Hitler's invincibility. The German people, who had been promised a quick victory, began to feel the true, devastating weight of the war in the East. They sent winter clothing and supplies, a public acknowledgement that the army was suffering. The campaign that was supposed to secure the 1,000-year Reich had instead become the beginning of its inevitable bloody end. Hitler, isolated in his bunker, was now a dictator who blamed everyone but himself for the failure, trapped by his own disastrous, fatal turn. The horrifying scale of the Holocaust was not an accidental byproduct of war. It was the deliberate, engineered fulfillment of a hatred that Adolf Hitler had nursed for decades. This chapter confronts the darkest chapter of his 12-year rule, showing how the state's resources were entirely directed toward the efficient genocide of Jews, Roma, and others labeled as undesirable. The transition from disorganized violence and mass shootings to a streamlined, industrial process of extermination marked a chilling new low in human history, all flowing directly from the fanaticism articulated in the pages of Mein Kampf. By 1942, the Nazi regime controlled a massive empire stretching across Europe. Millions of Jewish people were now under their direct command. The initial methods of killing, mass shootings by specialized Einsatzgruppen squads, were brutal, but the Nazi leadership found them too slow and psychologically stressful for the shooters. Hitler's regime sought a more efficient, less messy method. This chilling operational shift was finalized in a quiet suburb of Berlin. The Wannsee Logistics in January 1942, 15 top Nazi bureaucrats met at a lovely villa on the shores of the Wannsee Lake. This meeting, the infamous Wannsee Conference, was not to decide if they should kill the Jewish population. That decision had already been made by Hitler. The goal was to figure out how to do it on an unprecedented scale. Under the leadership of SS General Reinhard Heydrich and organized by Adolf Eichmann, the group matter-of-factly discussed the logistics of the final solution. They treated the removal of an entire people like a government-mandated construction project. The meeting's minutes, written in cold, bureaucratic language, detailed the plan to sweep Europe from west to east, rounding up all Jewish citizens. These officials discussed train schedules, transportation capacity, and the methods needed to move millions of people to territories in the east. The conference ensured that all branches of the German state, not just the SS, would cooperate in this industrialized genocide. Ghettos and deportation, the first step in this grand plan, was to squeeze the Jewish population into tightly controlled urban areas called ghettos. Across Poland, cities like Warsaw and Lodz saw entire neighborhoods walled off and turned into overcrowded open-air prisons. Conditions in these ghettos were deliberately designed to kill. Hundreds of thousands of people were crammed into spaces meant for only a few thousand. Food and medicine were severely restricted, leading to mass starvation and rampant disease like typhus. People died daily in the streets, but still the Nazis searched and gathered more to fill the void. Following the Wannsee Conference, the liquidation of these ghettos began. Nazi officials organized endless streams of trains. These trains, consisting of sealed cattle wagons, would be filled with thousands of men, women, and children. The conditions inside were inhumane, without food, water, sanitation, or adequate air. Many deportees died during the multi-day journeys before ever reaching their destination. The purpose-built camps, the destination for most of these transports, was the final solutions, terrifying innovation, purpose-built extermination camps, or death factories. While the Nazis had operated concentration camps like Dachau since 1933, those were primarily for forced labor and political imprisonment. The death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Chelmno, and Belzec, were designed specifically for rapid mass murder. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the main symbol of this industrial killing. Located in occupied Poland, it was the largest death factory and combined both forced labor and extermination facilities. As the trains pulled onto the platform, a terrifying selection process took place. Families were immediately torn apart. SS doctors would quickly scan the new arrivals. Those deemed fit for work, a small minority, were sent into the brutal conditions of the labor camp. The vast majority, including almost all children, the elderly, and the sick, were immediately sent to the gas chambers. Industrial killing and deception to maintain order and prevent panic, the Nazis relied on elaborate deception. Victims were told they were arriving at a transit camp and needed to be disinfected or have a shower before continuing their journey. They were ordered to undress and leave their luggage, with the promise they could reclaim it later. The victims were then herded into massive, sealed underground rooms that looked exactly like group shower facilities, complete with fake shower heads. Once the massive doors were sealed, SS technicians would drop pellets of the deadly pesticide Zyklon B into the ventilation shafts. Within 20 minutes, thousands of people inside would be dead. The Nazis then streamlined the next horrifying step, removing the bodies. Specialized groups of Jewish prisoners, known as Sonderkommandos, were forced under the threat of death to remove the corpses, extract any gold teeth, and burn the bodies in massive industrial crematoria. These furnaces burned around the clock, releasing thick gray smoke that cast a constant pall over the camp and its surroundings. Factories and efficiency. The death factories were organized with a gruesome sense of efficiency. The victims' property, clothing, jewelry, suitcases, and even human hair, which was sold for making products, was collected, sorted, and cataloged. Giant warehouses, nicknamed Canada by the inmates because of the perceived wealth inside, were filled with these looted personal belongings. The entire system was a factory in the truest sense of the word. Its raw material was human beings, and its final product was corpses, with every effort made to extract maximum economic value from both before disposal. At the peak of its operation in 1944, Auschwitz was murdering and cremating nearly 10,000 people every day. This state-sponsored industrial murder continued until the very end of the war, with resources like precious trains being used for deportations, even as the German army desperately needed them on the front lines. The Holocaust was not just a result of a war. It was, in Hitler's mind, a central part of the war itself. A war against an enemy he had vowed to destroy. The year 1942 began with an illusion of strength for the Third Reich, but it would end in a catastrophe that broke the back of the German war machine. Adolf Hitler, now deeply entrenched in his Eastern Front military headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, was growing increasingly impatient. Operation Barbarossa had failed to capture Moscow the previous winter, and now he demanded a new, decisive blow against the Soviet Union. He was convinced that one more massive offensive would cause the entire communist edifice to collapse. He overruled his professional generals, dismissing their warnings about overextended supply lines and intelligence reports regarding massive Soviet reserves. Hitler was no longer just the political leader of Germany. He was now the active supreme commander of the army, and he believed his will alone could dictate reality on the battlefield. The new plan was called Case Blue. The goal was simple but incredibly ambitious. German forces would drive south toward the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler needed that oil to fuel his navy and air force for a long war against the combined power of the British Empire and the United States. As a secondary objective, almost as an afterthought fueled by ego, he ordered General Friedrich Paulus and the Sixth Army, the most powerful single formation in the entire Wehrmacht, to capture the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The city bore the name of his great rival, Joseph Stalin, and capturing it would be a massive propaganda victory. It was a fatal decision born of hubris. Hitler had split his forces, attempting to achieve two massive goals at once, underestimating the enemy's resilience and the brutal geography of the Russian steppe. Through the summer of 1942, Case Blue seemed to be working. The German panzer divisions sliced through southern Russia. General Paulus and the Sixth Army advanced rapidly toward Stalingrad. By August, German bombers had reduced much of the city to rubble, and the infantry had entered the streets. To Hitler, looking at the maps in the safe comfort of his headquarters, victory seemed certain. He publicly boasted that no power on earth could remove the German soldier from Stalingrad. He believed that the Volga River, a vital transport artery for the Soviet Union, had been cut, and that Stalin's regime was on its deathbed. He received daily reports of progress, measured in blocks and factory districts captured, and his confidence swelled into arrogance. He became dismissive of foreign enemies and intolerant of any general who suggested caution. But inside the city, the reality was a nightmare that the German maps could not capture. The Soviet defenders, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, adopted a brutal tactic, hugging the enemy. They stayed as close to the German lines as possible, preventing the Luftwaffe from bombing them without hitting their own troops. The battle degenerated into a vicious, close-quarters struggle amidst the ruins. Every ruined factory, every cellar, and every pile of rubble became a fortress. It was Rattenkrieg, War of the Rats. The technical and mobile superiority of the Wehrmacht was useless in this environment. General Paulus, a man known for his meticulous planning but lacking battlefield intuition, was forced into an attritional struggle that chewed up his elite infantry. He repeatedly radioed Hitler for reinforcements, warning that his flank defenses, manned by poorly equipped Romanian and Italian allies, were weak. Hitler ignored these pleas. He was obsessed with the prize. He demanded Stalingrad be taken at any cost. While Hitler focused solely on the internal factory fight in the city center, the Soviet High Command, under Generals Zhukov and Vasylovsky, was planning a masterstroke. They saw the weakness that Hitler had created. Operation Uranus was launched on November 19, 1942. Massive Soviet armored columns struck the weak Romanian forces guarding Paulus's northern and southern flanks. The Allied lines disintegrated almost instantly. Within 4 days, the Soviet pincers met west of the city, at the town of Kalach. General Paulus and the entire Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 men, were trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide. It was the greatest encirclement of a German army in history, and it was entirely Hitler's fault. When the news reached Hitler, he refused to accept the reality. His initial shock turned into a cold, paranoid rage. He did not blame himself for overextending his forces. He blamed the Romanians for cowardice and his own generals for defeatism. General Paulus, recognizing the mortal danger, radioed headquarters asking for permission to immediately attempt a breakout to the west before the Soviet ring became too strong. This was the only rational military option. But Hitler, cocooned in his bunker mentality, issued a disastrous no-retreat order. He declared Stalingrad a fortress, Festung, and commanded the Sixth Army to hold their ground. He promised Paulus that they would be supplied from the air until a relief force could break through. This promise was a complete fantasy. Hermann Göring, the arrogant chief of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his transport planes could deliver the required 500 tons of supplies daily to the trapped army. It was a lie born of the need to please the Führer. Veteran Luftwaffe commanders warned that it was impossible, especially with the onset of the brutal Russian winter and strong Soviet air defenses. Hitler chose to believe Göring's lie over the professional judgment of his pilots. The resulting airlift was a catastrophe. On average, the planes delivered less than 100 tons a day, much of it useless, like thousands of pounds of pepper or condoms instead of fuel and ammunition. German soldiers, already exhausted from months of fighting, began to starve. They were forced to slaughter their horses, and then they had nothing. As December arrived, the Kessel, cauldron, became a frozen hell. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The German soldiers were still in their summer uniforms. They had no winter clothing because Hitler had expected a quick victory. Thousands died daily from frostbite, typhus, and starvation. Ammunition was so low that Paulus had to ration shells, limiting firing to only when absolutely necessary. General Erich von Manstein, Hitler's best operational commander, attempted a relief mission from the south, called Operation Winter Storm. He managed to get within 30 miles of the pocket. He begged Hitler to allow Paulus to break out and meet him, as it was their only chance. But Hitler remained adamant. The Sixth Army must hold Stalingrad. He refused to give up the propaganda prize, even if it meant the death of his best army. Manstein's relief force was too weak to break the outer Soviet ring and was eventually forced to retreat, sealing the fate of the Sixth Army. Inside the cauldron, the horror was total. Dead bodies, frozen as hard as stone, were piled up to serve as windbreaks or to reinforce defensive positions. The hospitals were nightmares, with thousands of wounded men lying on filthy straw, receiving no medicine or food, slowly freezing to death. Soviet loudspeaker propaganda played throughout the night, counting the seconds. Every 7 seconds a German soldier dies in Russia. Stalingrad, mass grave. Discipline began to break down in some units, but most men continued to fight, trapped between the advancing Soviets and the fear of Hitler's orders against surrender. By January 1943, the end was inevitable. The Soviets launched Operation Ring, systematically squeezing the pocket and capturing the vital airfields, cutting off the last meager air supply. General Paulus, himself sick and despairing, radioed Hitler on January 24, describing the collapse of his front, the starvation, the lack of ammunition, and the thousands of untreated wounded. He again begged for permission to surrender to save his remaining men. Hitler's response was cold and fanatical. Surrender is forbidden. Sixth Army will hold their positions to the last man and the last round. He wanted a heroic legend of sacrifice to use for propaganda at home. The actual lives of the soldiers did not matter to him. In a final, cynical act on January 30, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to Generalfeldmarschall. This was a clear message. As no German field marshal in history had ever been captured alive, Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than surrender. Paulus, however, was done obeying a leader who had betrayed him. On January 31, 1943, Soviet troops entered his headquarters in the basement of a ruined department store. Paulus surrendered his remaining force of roughly 90,000 men. Only 6,000 of them would survive the brutality of Soviet captivity to eventually return to Germany years later. The defeat at Stalingrad was a psychological and military earthquake that shattered the Third Reich. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was gone forever. For the first time, the German public was told the truth about a massive military catastrophe, plunging the nation into mourning. Hitler himself entered a period of profound depression and rage. He retreated further into physical and mental isolation, spending his time in his fortified, windowless bunkers, rarely appearing in public again. He became convinced that his generals were traitors, and that the German people were not strong enough to realize his grand visions. The crushing defeat on the Volga signaled the beginning of the inevitable end for Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. The war was lost. By the summer of 1944, even the most dedicated Nazi officers could see the reality. The glorious Third Reich, which Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, was crumbling on all sides. The Soviet Red Army was pushing brutally from the east, retaking territory faster than the Germans could retreat. In the west, the Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were steadily liberating France. German cities were being turned into piles of brick and ash by endless Allied bombing raids. The German people were tired, hungry, and terrified. But inside the fortified bunkers and headquarters where Adolf Hitler hid, reality was not welcome. As the situation got worse, a growing group of high-ranking military officers, aristocrats, and government officials decided that Germany could not survive with Hitler in power. They believed his madness was leading the nation to complete and absolute destruction. They saw him not as a great leader, but as the internal enemy. This group, which included famous generals like Erwin Rommel, though his exact role is still debated, and key figures like General Ludwig Beck and Karl Goerdeler, had been discussing removing Hitler for years. But now, with the enemy at the gates, their discussion turned into a desperate, violent plan, Operation Valkyrie. The plan was complex and dangerous. It used an existing Nazi emergency plan called Valkyrie, which was designed to use the reserve army to maintain order in case of a worker uprising or internal chaos. The conspirators, who held key positions within the military, planned to change this emergency plan. Their idea was to kill Hitler, then use the reserve army to arrest the top SS leaders, Gestapo officials, and Nazi party chiefs, claiming they were the ones who had staged a coup and murdered the Führer. Once they controlled Berlin and other major cities, they hoped to set up a new government, negotiate an honorable peace with the Western Allies, and somehow save Germany from complete ruin, especially from Soviet occupation. The hardest part of the plan was the murder itself. Hitler was paranoid and constantly changed his schedule. He was always surrounded by loyal SS guards, and anyone getting near him was carefully checked for weapons. Many previous plots had failed because Hitler unexpectedly changed his plans or because bombs failed to explode. The conspirators needed someone who could get close to Hitler during a military briefing. They found that man in Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg was a perfect fit. He was a distinguished war hero who had lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand in a bombing in North Africa. Despite his severe injuries, he remained a respected and capable staff officer. His aristocratic background and military bravery made him less suspicious than others. Most importantly, as the newly appointed chief of staff for the reserve army, he had a legitimate reason to attend meetings with Hitler at his various military headquarters. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg was called to a critical military briefing with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair Wolfschanz, a hidden, heavily fortified command complex in the forests of East Prussia. This was the moment. Stauffenberg arrived with his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Heefen. In Stauffenberg's briefcase were 2 blocks of plastic explosive, each with a time delay fuse. The plan was simple: activate the fuses, place the briefcase in the briefing room near Hitler, and leave before the explosion. Upon arrival at the Wolf's Lair, Stauffenberg was incredibly nervous but managed to hide it. He asked to use a small room to freshen up and change his shirt before the meeting, giving him a chance to activate the bomb. This proved difficult with his injured hand. He struggled to use the tongs needed to break the glass vial that would start the acid-based time fuse. Time was running out, and a guard knocked on the door, telling him to hurry. In the rush and confusion, Stauffenberg only managed to activate one of the 2 explosive blocks. He put the single, live bomb into his briefcase, left the second block with Heefen, and hurried to the conference hut. The briefing had already started when Stauffenberg entered the room. The Wolf's Lair was often hot, and the meeting had been moved from a concrete bunker to a wooden barrack-style building. This was a critical detail Stauffenberg didn't know. The wooden building would not contain the explosion's pressure, making the bomb less deadly. The room was crowded, with Hitler sitting at a massive, thick oak table, surrounded by generals and staff officers who were looking at war maps. Stauffenberg greeted Hitler and managed to place his briefcase under the heavy oak table, positioning it right next to a table leg, just a few feet from where Hitler was leaning. Stauffenberg then made an excuse to use the telephone and quietly slipped out of the hut, leaving his briefcase behind. He made it to his staff car and waited with Heffen. Inside the hut, the briefing continued. Just minutes after Stauffenberg left, the single-activated bomb in the briefcase exploded with terrific force. The wooden hut was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. Windows were shattered, the roof collapsed, and a thick, choking cloud of yellow smoke and debris filled the air. Several officers were thrown from the building. To Stauffenberg, watching from his car a few hundred feet away, the hut looked like it had been hit by a direct bomb from a plane. It seemed impossible that anyone inside could have survived. Convinced his mission was successful and Hitler was dead, Stauffenberg immediately pushed Heffen to drive them to the airport. In their hurry, Heffen threw the second, unused explosive block out of the car window, an error that investigators later found. They flew directly back to Berlin, eager to activate Operation Valkyrie and seize control of the government. But Stauffenberg's confidence was a tragic mistake. Hitler was alive. The thick, heavy oak table leg, next to which Stauffenberg had placed the briefcase, had acted as a shield, absorbing the main force of the explosion. Additionally, because the briefing was in a wooden hut, the blast wave blew out the windows and walls easily, reducing the deadly pressure inside the room. Several other officers were killed or severely injured, but Hitler suffered only minor burns, some cuts from flying debris and perforated eardrums. He was shaken, covered in soot, and his uniform was torn, but he was very much alive. Within hours, he was proudly showing the destroyed room to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who happened to visit that day, bragging that his survival was proof that he was destined by Providence to lead Germany. Back in Berlin, at the Bendele block, the military headquarters for the Reserve Army, the coup was falling into confusion. Stauffenberg arrived hours late, and in his absence, the conspirators were unsure of what to do. Rumors that Hitler had survived were already spreading. Some loyal Nazi officers in Berlin began to question the orders they were receiving. The vital communication centers were not properly controlled by the plotters. The key moment was when Stauffenberg finally reached the Bendele block and desperately tried to convince General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the Reserve Army, to fully launch Operation Valkyrie. Fromm, a cautious man who knew about the plot but wanted to see if it would succeed, decided that Hitler must be dead. He issued initial Valkyrie orders, and some units began moving in Berlin. However, the tide was already turning against them. A key event happened at the Central Radio and Communication Station in Berlin. Major Otto Remer, who commanded an elite guard unit, received orders from Fromm to arrest top Nazi officials, including Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels, always clever, arranged for Remer to speak directly on the telephone with Hitler himself, who was still at the Wolf's Lair. Hearing the Führer's voice, Major Remer immediately switched loyalty. Hitler promoted him on the spot and ordered him to use his unit to suppress the coup and protect the government. Remer quickly broadcasted that Hitler was alive and that a small group of criminal officers was attempting a coup. This message, more than anything else, doomed the plot. Reserve Army units across Germany who had been confused now knew who to obey. The coup in Berlin, Vienna, and other cities collapsed rapidly. Inside the Bendele block, the end was swift. As Major Remer's loyal troops surrounded the building, the remaining conspirators faced reality. General Fromm, seeing that the coup had failed and desperate to save his own life by covering up his knowledge of the plot, turned on his former friends. He arrested Stauffenberg, General Beck, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Werner von Heefen. In a desperate, self-serving move, Fromm held a quick, unofficial military court in his office, found them all guilty of high treason, and sentenced them to immediate death. Around midnight on July 20, Klaus von Stauffenberg, Merz von Quernheim, Werner von Heefen, and another brave conspirator, Colonel General Friedrich Albrecht, were led down into the Bendeleblock's dark inner courtyard. They were illuminated only by the headlights of a military vehicle. A small firing squad stood ready. As they were about to be shot, Werner von Heefen courageously threw himself in front of Stauffenberg, trying to take the first bullets himself. After Heefen fell, Stauffenberg is said to have shouted his final words before the shots ran out: "Long live our sacred Germany." They were all buried immediately in a nearby churchyard, though SS leader Heinrich Himmler later ordered their bodies dug up, cremated, and their ashes scattered over sewage fields, so that no trace of them would remain. General Beck, given the chance to commit suicide, failed to do so and had to be shot by a sergeant. Hitler was not satisfied with just these immediate deaths. His rage was monstrous. He felt betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect him, the old, aristocratic military elite whom he had long distrusted. He ordered a brutal, complete, and terrifying purge across Germany. The Gestapo began arresting anyone remotely connected to the conspirators, as well as their friends, family members, and anyone even slightly suspected of criticizing the regime. Thousands were thrown into concentration camps or prisons. A series of show trials began before the People's Court, a terrifying kangaroo court led by the infamous Judge Roland Freisler, a man known for screaming at and insulting defendants. These trials were recorded on film, meant to be shown to the public to terrorize them, though they proved too horrifying for popular distribution. Conspirators, many of whom had been severely tortured, were brought into court often disheveled and forced to defend themselves against Freisler's endless screaming. Their lawyers were not allowed to properly defend them. Famous field marshals and generals were stripped of their ranks and uniforms, made to wear ill-fitting civilian clothes, and then publicly humiliated before being sentenced to death. The execution method chosen by Hitler for many was deliberately medieval and brutal. They were not shot as soldiers, but hanged using thin piano wire suspended from meat hooks, designed to cause a long, slow, and extremely painful death by strangulation, rather than a quick death from a broken neck. This terrible process was also filmed and shown to Hitler, who reportedly watched the footage with satisfaction. Prominent figures like Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the former head of military intelligence, were among those executed in this way, stripped naked and tortured for weeks before their final agony. The purge also targeted figures who were not directly involved in the Valkyrie plot but who were seen as potential future leaders or critics of the regime. General Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, who had been injured in an Allied attack just before July 20, was implicated. Knowing his popularity, Hitler decided a public trial was impossible. Instead, Rommel was given a choice: face trial and drag his family into disgrace, or commit suicide and be given a state funeral with full military honors, his family being protected. Rommel chose suicide, taking poison in a staff car. The true story of his death was hidden for years. The failure of the July 20 plot and the brutal purge that followed had a disastrous impact on Germany. It cemented Hitler's absolute power for the final, bloody year of the war. It removed many of the only people who might have been able to negotiate a peace that could have saved countless lives, both German and Allied. With all internal opposition destroyed, The regime entered an atmosphere of utter, paralyzing terror, where even the slightest doubt was seen as treason. The war would now continue to its horrific, bitter end, until the last bunker was taken, as Hitler was determined to drag the entire German nation down into the abyss with him. The tragic failure of Operation Valkyrie meant that there was now no hope for a political solution. Only complete military collapse and the absolute ruin of Germany could bring the monster to his end. The internal enemy had been destroyed, but at the cost of the nation itself. The war was lost. By the summer of 1944, even the most dedicated Nazi officers could see the reality. The glorious Third Reich, which Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, was crumbling on all sides. The Soviet Red Army was pushing brutally from the east, retaking territory faster than the Germans could retreat. In the west, the Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were steadily liberating France. German cities were being turned into piles of brick and ash by endless Allied bombing raids. The German people were tired, hungry, and terrified. But inside the fortified bunkers and headquarters where Adolf Hitler hid, reality was not welcome. As the situation got worse, a growing group of high-ranking military officers, aristocrats, and government officials decided that Germany could not survive with Hitler in power. They believed his madness was leading the nation to complete and absolute destruction. They saw him not as a great leader, but as the internal enemy. This group, which included famous generals like Erwin Rommel, though his exact role is still debated, and key figures like General Ludwig Beck and Karl Goerdeler, had been discussing removing Hitler for years. But now, with the enemy at the gates, their discussion turned into a desperate, violent plan, Operation Valkyrie. The plan was complex and dangerous. It used an existing Nazi emergency plan called Valkyrie, which was designed to use the reserve army to maintain order in case of a worker uprising or internal chaos. The conspirators, who held key positions within the military, planned to change this emergency plan. Their idea was to kill Hitler, then use the reserve army to arrest the top SS leaders, Gestapo officials, and Nazi party chiefs, claiming they were the ones who had staged a coup and murdered the Führer. Once they controlled Berlin and other major cities, they hoped to set up a new government, negotiate an honorable peace with the Western Allies, and somehow save Germany from complete ruin, especially from Soviet occupation. The hardest part of the plan was the murder itself. Hitler was paranoid and constantly changed his schedule. He was always surrounded by loyal SS guards, and anyone getting near him was carefully checked for weapons. Many previous plots had failed because Hitler unexpectedly changed his plans or because bombs failed to explode. The conspirators needed someone who could get close to Hitler during a military briefing. They found that man in Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg was a perfect fit. He was a distinguished war hero who had lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand in a bombing in North Africa. Despite his severe injuries, he remained a respected and capable staff officer. His aristocratic background and military bravery made him less suspicious than others. Most importantly, as the newly appointed chief of staff for the reserve army, he had a legitimate reason to attend meetings with Hitler at his various military headquarters. On July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg was called to a critical military briefing with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair Wolfschanz, a hidden, heavily fortified command complex in the forests of East Prussia. This was the moment. Stauffenberg arrived with his adjutant, Lieutenant Werner von Heefen. In Stauffenberg's briefcase were 2 blocks of plastic explosive, each with a time delay fuse. The plan was simple: activate the fuses, place the briefcase in the briefing room near Hitler, and leave before the explosion. Upon arrival at the Wolf's Lair, Stauffenberg was incredibly nervous but managed to hide it. He asked to use a small room to freshen up and change his shirt before the meeting, giving him a chance to activate the bomb. This proved difficult with his injured hand. He struggled to use the tongs needed to break the glass vial that would start the acid-based time fuse. Time was running out, and a guard knocked on the door, telling him to hurry. In the rush and confusion, Stauffenberg only managed to activate one of the two explosive blocks. He put the single, live bomb into his briefcase, left the second block with Hefen, and hurried to the conference hut. The briefing had already started when Stauffenberg entered the room. The wolf's lair was often hot, and the meeting had been moved from a concrete bunker to a wooden barrack-style building. This was a critical detail Stauffenberg didn't know. The wooden building would not contain the explosion's pressure, making the bomb less deadly. The room was crowded, with Hitler sitting at a massive, thick oak table, surrounded by generals and staff officers who were looking at war maps. Stauffenberg greeted Hitler and managed to place his briefcase under the heavy oak table, positioning it right next to a table leg, just a few feet from where Hitler was leaning. Stauffenberg then made an excuse to use the telephone and quietly slipped out of the hut, leaving his briefcase behind. He made it to his staff car and waited with Hefen. Inside the hut, the briefing continued. Just minutes after Stauffenberg left, the single activated bomb in the briefcase exploded with terrific force. The wooden hut was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. Windows were shattered, the roof collapsed, and a thick, choking cloud of yellow smoke and debris filled the air. Several officers were thrown from the building. To Stauffenberg, watching from his car a few hundred feet away, the hut looked like it had been hit by a direct bomb from a plane. It seemed impossible that anyone inside could have survived. Convinced his mission was successful and Hitler was dead, Stauffenberg immediately pushed Hefen to drive them to the airport. In their hurry, Hefen threw the second, unused explosive block out of the car window, an error that investigators later found. They flew directly back to Berlin, eager to activate Operation Valkyrie and seize control of the government. But Stauffenberg's confidence was a tragic mistake. Hitler was alive. The thick, heavy oak table leg, next to which Stauffenberg had placed the briefcase, had acted as a shield, absorbing the main force of the explosion. Additionally, because the briefing was in a wooden hut, the blast wave blew out the windows and walls easily, reducing the deadly pressure inside the room. Several other officers were killed or severely injured, but Hitler suffered only minor burns, some cuts from flying debris and perforated eardrums. He was shaken, covered in soot, and his uniform was torn, but he was very much alive. Within hours, he was proudly showing the destroyed room to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who happened to visit that day, bragging that his survival was proof that he was destined by Providence to lead Germany. Back in Berlin, at the Bendele block, the military headquarters for the Reserve Army, the coup was falling into confusion. Stauffenberg arrived hours late, and in his absence, the conspirators were unsure of what to do. Rumors that Hitler had survived were already spreading. Some loyal Nazi officers in Berlin began to question the orders they were receiving. The vital communication centers were not properly controlled by the plotters. The key moment was when Stauffenberg finally reached the Bendele block and desperately tried to convince General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the Reserve Army, to fully launch Operation Valkyrie. Fromm, a cautious man who knew about the plot but wanted to see if it would succeed, decided that Hitler must be dead. He issued initial Valkyrie orders, and some units began moving in Berlin. However, the tide was already turning against them. A key event happened at the Central Radio and Communication Station in Berlin. Major Otto Remer, who commanded an elite guard unit, received orders from Fromm to arrest top Nazi officials, including Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels, always clever, arranged for Rewrote to speak directly on the telephone with Hitler himself, who was still at the Wolf's Lair. Hearing the Führer's voice, Major Rewrote immediately switched loyalty. Hitler promoted him on the spot and ordered him to use his unit to suppress the coup and protect the government. Rewrote quickly broadcasted that Hitler was alive and that a small group of criminal officers was attempting a coup. This message, more than anything else, doomed the plot. Reserve army units across Germany who had been confused now knew who to obey. The coup in Berlin, Vienna, and other cities collapsed rapidly. Inside the Bendele block, the end was swift. As Major Rewrote's loyal troops surrounded the building, the remaining conspirators faced reality. General Fromm, seeing that the coup had failed and desperate to save his own life by covering up his knowledge of the plot, turned on his former friends. He arrested Stauffenberg, General Beck, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Werner von Heefen. In a desperate, self-serving move, Fromm held a quick, unofficial military court in his office, found them all guilty of high treason, and sentenced them to immediate death. Around midnight on July 20, Klaus von Stauffenberg, Merz von Quernheim, Werner von Heefen, and another brave conspirator, Colonel General Friedrich Albrecht, were led down into the Bendele block's dark inner courtyard. They were illuminated only by the headlights of a military vehicle. A small firing squad stood ready. As they were about to be shot, Werner von Heefen courageously threw himself in front of Stauffenberg, trying to take the first bullets himself. After Heefen fell, Stauffenberg is said to have shouted his final words before the shots ran out: "Long live our sacred Germany." They were all buried immediately in a nearby churchyard, though SS leader Heinrich Himmler later ordered their bodies dug up, cremated, and their ashes scattered over sewage fields so that no trace of them would remain. General Beck, given the chance to commit suicide, failed to do so and had to be shot by a sergeant. Hitler was not satisfied with just these immediate deaths. His rage was monstrous. He felt betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect him, the old, aristocratic military elite whom he had long distrusted. He ordered a brutal, complete, and terrifying purge across Germany. The Gestapo began arresting anyone remotely connected to the conspirators, as well as their friends, family members, and anyone even slightly suspected of criticizing the regime. Thousands were thrown into concentration camps or prisons. A series of show trials began before the People's Court, a terrifying kangaroo court led by the infamous Judge Roland Freisler, a man known for screaming at and insulting defendants. These trials were recorded on film, meant to be shown to the public to terrorize them, though they proved too horrifying for popular distribution. Conspirators, many of whom had been severely tortured, were brought into court often disheveled and forced to defend themselves against Freisler's endless screaming. Their lawyers were not allowed to properly defend them. Famous field marshals and generals were stripped of their ranks and uniforms, made to wear ill-fitting civilian clothes, and then publicly humiliated before being sentenced to death. The execution method chosen by Hitler for many was deliberately medieval and brutal. They were not shot as soldiers, but hanged using thin piano wire suspended from meat hooks, designed to cause a long, slow, and extremely painful death by strangulation, rather than a quick death from a broken neck. This terrible process was also filmed and shown to Hitler, who reportedly watched the footage with satisfaction. Prominent figures like Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the former head of military intelligence, were among those executed in this way, stripped naked and tortured for weeks before their final agony. The purge also targeted figures who were not directly involved in the Valkyrie plot but who were seen as potential future leaders or critics of the regime. General Erwin Rommel, the famous Desert Fox, who had been injured in an Allied attack just before July 20, was implicated. Knowing his popularity, Hitler decided a public trial was impossible. Instead, Rommel was given a choice: face trial and drag his family into disgrace, or commit suicide and be given a state funeral with full military honors, his family being protected. Rommel chose suicide, taking poison in a staff car. The true story of his death was hidden for years. The failure of the July 20 plot and the brutal purge that followed had a disastrous impact on Germany. It cemented Hitler's absolute power for the final, bloody year of the war. It removed many of the only people who might have been able to negotiate a peace that could have saved countless lives, both German and Allied. With all internal opposition destroyed, the regime entered an atmosphere of utter, paralyzing terror, where even the slightest doubt was seen as treason. The war would now continue to its horrific, bitter end, until the last bunker was taken, as Hitler was determined to drag the entire German nation down into the abyss with him. The tragic failure of Operation Valkyrie meant that there was now no hope for a political solution. Only complete military collapse and the absolute ruin of Germany could bring the monster to his end.